July 7th, 2024, polar bear devours entire dog sled team in northern Canada. The Arctic wind howled across the barren landscape of Resolute Bay, carrying with it the scent of ice and death that would forever change the life of Daniel James Peters. At 34 years old, Daniel had spent the better part of 2 decades traversing the frozen wilderness of northern Canada. His team of 8 carefully trained sled dogs, his only companions in a world where temperatures routinely dropped to 40 below zero, and the sun disappeared for months at a time. What began as a routine training expedition on that fateful July morning would become one of the most harrowing polar bear encounters ever documented in the Canadian Arctic, a nightmare that would leave 1 man forever scarred and 8 loyal animals dead in the snow. Daniel Peters had been born and raised in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, the son of Marcus Peters, a veteran bush pilot who had spent 30 years flying supplies to remote mining camps, and Sarah Chen Peters, a veterinarian who specialized in treating working dogs across the Northern Territories. From the moment he could walk, Daniel had been surrounded by dogs, Malamutes, Huskies, and the occasional wolf hybrid that his mother would nurse back to health after injuries sustained in the harsh northern climate. His childhood had been spent learning the intricate art of dog sledding from his maternal grandfather, William Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had come to Canada in the 1950s and had adapted the traditional techniques of Inuit mushers with his own innovative training methods. By the time Daniel reached his teens, he had already begun developing his own unique approach to long-distance sledding, focusing on the psychological bond between musher and dogs, rather than relying solely on traditional command structures. His philosophy was simple: treat each dog as an individual with its own personality, fears and motivations, and the team would respond with loyalty and performance that exceeded anything achieved through mere discipline. This approach had served him well over the years, earning him recognition in several regional competitions and establishing him as one of the most respected mushers in the Northwest Territories. The team that accompanied Daniel on that July expedition represented years of careful breeding and training. Leading the pack was Thunder, a massive male Alaskan Malamute with piercing blue eyes and a coat of silver and white that caught the Arctic sunlight like freshly fallen snow. Thunder had been with Daniel for 7 years, rescued as a puppy from an abusive owner in Whitehorse and nursed back to health by Daniel's mother. The dog possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate even in complete whiteout conditions, relying on some combination of scent, sound, and magnetic sense that Daniel had never fully understood but had learned to trust completely. Running alongside Thunder was his lifelong companion Luna, a female Siberian husky whose intelligence bordered on the uncanny. Luna had been born in Daniel's own yard 5 years earlier, the product of a carefully planned breeding between Thunder and a champion racing dog named Storm. Where Thunder provided raw power and navigational instinct, Luna brought strategy and communication, often barking specific warnings to alert the team to changes in ice conditions or approaching weather fronts. Her coat was a striking combination of black and white, with distinctive markings around her eyes that gave her an almost mask-like appearance. The 3rd position was held by Bear, ironically named given the events that would unfold. A powerful male Canadian Eskimo dog whose bloodline traced back to the traditional sled dogs used by Inuit hunters for generations. Bear had joined the team 3 years earlier when his previous owner, an elderly Inuit man named Anu Kanguk, had passed away and left instructions that his dog should go to someone who would honor their heritage. Bear possessed the raw strength and endurance of his ancestors, capable of pulling tremendous loads across impossible terrain. But he also carried the independent spirit that made him both valuable and occasionally challenging to manage. Rounding out the front of the team were 2 younger dogs, Arctic and Storm, both 2-year-old Greenland dogs that Daniel had acquired as part of an exchange program with mushers in Denmark. Arctic was a white male with extraordinary speed and agility, while Storm was a grey female known for her problem-solving abilities and calm temperament under pressure. The two had formed an inseparable bond during their journey from Greenland and worked together with a synchronization that often left other mushers amazed. The rear positions were filled by the remaining 3 team members. Scout, a 4-year-old mixed breed whose heritage included wolf genetics that gave him exceptional sensory capabilities but required careful management. Frost, a 3-year-old female Alaskan husky known for her gentle nature and ability to calm the other dogs during stressful situations. And finally Blaze, the youngest member of the team at just 18 months old, a male Siberian husky with distinctive red markings and an enthusiasm for running that sometimes outpaced his actual experience. Each dog had been equipped with a custom-fitted harness made from military-grade materials designed to distribute weight evenly and prevent chafing during long expeditions. The harnesses were connected to the main tow line using a specialized rigging system that Daniel had developed over years of trial and error, incorporating quick-release mechanisms that could detach individual dogs in case of emergency. The sled itself was a custom-built model constructed from aircraft aluminum and carbon fiber, weighing just 42 pounds empty, but capable of carrying up to 800 pounds of cargo across the most challenging terrain. The expedition that began on July 4th, 2024, was intended as a training run for the upcoming Iditarod qualifying season. Daniel had planned a circular route that would take the team approximately 250 kilometers northwest from Resolute Bay, following traditional hunting trails used by local Inuit families for generations. The route would cross several different types of terrain, from the relatively stable sea ice near the coast to the more challenging inland areas where wind-carved ridges and hidden crevasses could present serious obstacles. Weather conditions on the morning of departure had been nearly perfect for Arctic standards. The temperature held steady at -28 degrees Celsius, with winds from the northwest at 15 kilometers per hour, creating a wind chill factor that brought the effective temperature down to -38 degrees. Visibility extended to approximately 12 kilometers in all directions, with scattered high clouds that pose no immediate threat but would require monitoring as the expedition progressed. The barometric pressure had been stable for the previous 48 hours, suggesting that no major weather systems were approaching the area. Daniel had filed a comprehensive expedition plan with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Resolute Bay, as required by territorial regulations for solo travel in the Arctic. The plan included precise GPS coordinates for each planned campsite, estimated travel times between waypoints, emergency protocols, and detailed information about his equipment and supplies. Constable Michael Harrison, a 15-year veteran of Arctic policing, had reviewed the plan and found it thorough and well-conceived, noting in his report that Daniel's experience and preparation exceeded the standards typically seen in expedition planning. The first 3 days of the expedition proceeded exactly according to plan. The team covered an average of 65 kilometers per day, maintaining excellent pace despite challenging conditions that included a 6-hour stretch of travel through a region where ground blizzards reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Thunder's exceptional navigation skills proved invaluable during this section, as the dogs somehow maintained perfect direction, even when Daniel could barely see the lead dogs through the swirling snow. Camp procedures followed a rigid routine developed over years of Arctic travel. Each evening, Daniel would first secure the dogs, providing them with high-energy food consisting of a mixture of commercial dog food, frozen fish, and specially prepared fat cakes designed to provide maximum calories in harsh conditions. Water was provided by melting snow in insulated containers, with each dog receiving exactly 2 liters of fresh water regardless of conditions. The dogs were then bedded down in individual snow caves that Daniel would carve using a specialized Arctic shovel, each cave designed to trap body heat while providing protection from wind and snow. Daniel's own shelter consisted of a four-season mountaineering tent designed specifically for polar conditions, with a double-wall construction that prevented condensation buildup and guy lines rated to withstand winds up to 120 kilometers per hour. Inside the tent, a combination of sleeping bag, bivy sack and insulated pad provided protection from ground cold that could literally freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Cooking was accomplished using a multi-fuel stove capable of operating in extreme cold, burning a mixture of white gas and Arctic-grade additives that prevented fuel line freezing. Communication with the outside world was maintained through a combination of satellite phone and emergency beacon, with scheduled check-ins every 12 hours to the RCMP detachment. These communications were brief and professional, consisting primarily of position reports, weather observations, and confirmation that all team members, human and canine, remained in good health. Daniel's wife, Rebecca Martinez Peters, also received daily calls during which they would discuss expedition progress and share personal news, these conversations providing a vital psychological anchor to the world beyond the endless expanse of ice and snow. Rebecca, an emergency room physician at Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife, had initially been opposed to Daniel's extensive solo expeditions, concerned about the inherent risks of Arctic travel and the psychological toll of extended isolation. However, over their 8 years of marriage, she had come to understand that mushing was not simply Daniel's profession, but a fundamental part of his identity, as essential to his well-being as breathing. Their compromise involved extensive safety protocols, detailed emergency procedures, and Rebecca's own training in Arctic survival techniques so that she could serve as an effective coordinator in case of emergency. The couple had met during Daniel's recovery from a previous expedition incident in 2016, when a sudden ice breakup had forced him to abandon his sled and walk nearly 30 kilometers to safety with his dogs. Rebecca had been the attending physician when Daniel arrived at the hospital, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. What began as a professional medical relationship had evolved into romance over the weeks of Daniel's recovery, with Rebecca finding herself drawn to his quiet competence and deep respect for the Arctic environment. Their relationship had been tested by Daniel's commitment to expeditionary mushing, particularly after their daughter Emma was born in 2019. Rebecca struggled with anxiety about becoming a widow at 29, leaving their child to grow up without a father, while Daniel wrestled with guilt about pursuing his passion while having new family responsibilities. The solution had come through extensive counseling and the development of even more rigorous safety protocols, including Rebecca's completion of wilderness first aid training and Daniel's commitment to limiting solo expeditions to no more than 3 per year. Emma Marie Peters, now 5 years old, had inherited her father's love of dogs and her mother's analytical mind, spending her days asking detailed questions about everything from dog genetics to Arctic weather patterns. She had been born with a mild form of spina bifida that required ongoing medical management, but had never limited her curiosity or determination. Daniel carried a photograph of Emma and Rebecca in his expedition gear, along with a small stuffed husky that Emma had given him as a good luck charm for his travels. The support network for Daniel's expeditions extended far beyond his immediate family. His parents, Marcus and Sarah Peters, maintained a base of operations in Yellowknife that served as both equipment storage and emergency coordination center. Marcus's experience as a bush pilot provided invaluable expertise in weather interpretation and emergency planning. while Sarah's veterinary background ensured that the dogs received the highest level of care between expeditions. Both parents maintained current wilderness first aid certification and participated in annual training exercises designed to test emergency response procedures. Additional support came from a network of other mushers, bush pilots, trappers, and Inuit elders who shared information about trail conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife activity throughout the Arctic. This informal network, built over decades of mutual assistance and shared respect for the land, provided a safety net that extended across thousands of square kilometers of some of the most remote territory on Earth. Daniel made regular contributions to this network by sharing his own observations and assisting other travelers when circumstances permitted. The Aboriginal elders who provided guidance to Daniel had been particularly generous with their knowledge, understanding that respect for traditional ways could coexist with modern technology and safety equipment. Anyu Kanguk, the elderly man who had left Bear to Daniel's care, had spent his final years sharing stories and practical wisdom about reading weather signs, understanding animal behavior, and surviving in conditions that could kill the unprepared in hours. These lessons had proven invaluable during Daniel's expeditions, providing insights that no amount of modern equipment could replace. On the evening of July 6th, Daniel's regularly scheduled check-in with the RCMP detachment was routine and unremarkable. He reported his position as approximately 47 kilometers northwest of the planned third campsite, slightly ahead of schedule due to excellent trail conditions and favorable weather. The dogs were described as being in excellent condition, showing no signs of fatigue or stress despite 3 days of challenging travel. Weather observations included stable barometric pressure, clear skies with unlimited visibility, and temperatures holding steady at -31 degrees Celsius with light winds from the north-northeast. Constable Harrison noted in his log that Daniel sounded relaxed and confident during the communication, displaying none of the stress indicators that sometimes accompanied expeditions when conditions became challenging. The conversation lasted approximately 8 minutes and concluded with Daniel confirming his planned departure time of 0600 hours the following morning and his expected arrival at the fourth campsite by late afternoon. No concerns were expressed by either party, and the communication was logged as routine with no follow-up required. What neither Daniel nor the RCMP could have known was that approximately 15 kilometers southeast of Daniel's position, a massive male polar bear had begun tracking the scent trail left by the dog team. The bear, later estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh nearly 800 pounds and measure over 10 feet in length, had been without food for approximately 6 weeks as the summer ice breakup forced him inland from his preferred hunting grounds along the sea ice edge. Polar bears typically hunt seals by waiting at breathing holes in the sea ice, but climate change had increasingly forced bears to spend longer periods on land where food sources were scarce and competition was intense. This particular bear, designated as Bear M47 in subsequent wildlife reports, had been radio-collared 3 years earlier as part of a research program monitoring polar bear population dynamics in the high Arctic. Data from his collar indicated that he had traveled over 400 kilometers during the previous month, moving steadily inland as ice conditions deteriorated along the coast. His body weight had dropped by an estimated 30% since the collar data was last downloaded, indicating severe nutritional stress that would make him increasingly desperate and dangerous. Polar bears possess one of the most sophisticated olfactory systems in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting scent traces over distances exceeding 30 kilometers when wind conditions are favorable. The bear had likely first detected the dog team during the afternoon of July 5th, when shifting winds carried their scent across the landscape. The distinctive odor of domestic dogs, so different from the wild Arctic foxes and wolves that were his occasional prey, would have immediately attracted his attention and triggered hunting behaviors honed by millions of years of evolution. Bear behavioral specialists who later analyzed the tracking data determined that M47 had spent nearly 18 hours following the dog team's trail, moving with the patience and persistence that made polar bears such formidable predators. Unlike brown bears or black bears, which typically avoid human contact whenever possible, polar bears have no natural fear of humans and view them as potential prey rather than threats. This fundamental difference in behavior makes polar bear encounters exponentially more dangerous than encounters with other bear species. The bear's approach during the night of July 6th demonstrated the sophisticated hunting strategy that has allowed polar bears to survive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Rather than following directly behind the dog team, which might have alerted them to his presence, M47 had paralleled their course at a distance of approximately 3 kilometers, using wind direction and terrain features to mask his approach. This behavior indicated a level of tactical thinking that few people associate with wild animals, but which is actually common among apex predators. Daniel's final night of peaceful sleep began at approximately 9 p.m. on July 6th, after completing his evening routine of dog care, equipment maintenance, and personal preparation for the following day's travel. The dogs had settled quickly into their snow caves, showing none of the restlessness or anxiety that sometimes indicated the presence of predators in the area. Thunder, normally the most alert member of the team, had accepted his evening meal without the careful environmental scanning that typically accompanied feeding in unfamiliar territory. The tent that sheltered Daniel that night was positioned according to standard Arctic camping protocols, with the entrance facing away from prevailing winds and guy lines anchored to deadman anchors buried deep in the compressed snow. Inside the tent, Daniel's equipment was organized with military precision, each item in its designated location for easy access in case of emergency. His rifle, a .300 Winchester Magnum with a synthetic stock designed for extreme cold conditions, was positioned within arm's reach but secured against accidental discharge. Daniel's decision to carry the rifle had been made years earlier after a close encounter with a black bear during an expedition in northern British Columbia. The weapon was loaded with 220-grain premium hunting ammunition specifically chosen for its effectiveness against large predators at close range. Daniel maintained expert marksmanship certification and practiced regularly at ranges up to 300 meters, but he sincerely hoped never to use the weapon against a living target. His philosophy was that the rifle served primarily as insurance against worst-case scenarios, with bear spray and noisemakers being the preferred first lines of defense. The sleeping system that kept Daniel warm through the Arctic night consisted of multiple layers designed to maintain core body temperature even if the outer tent was compromised. A vapor barrier liner trapped body moisture and heat, while a down sleeping bag, rated to -40 degrees, provided primary insulation. An additional bivy sack created a backup vapor barrier and added another layer of wind protection. Daniel wore a base layer of merino wool and a mid-layer of synthetic insulation, with dry socks and a wool cap completing the system. Temperature inside the tent stabilized at approximately -15 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, but still cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Daniel's breathing created a small amount of condensation despite the tent's ventilation system, but this was within acceptable limits and posed no threat to the integrity of his shelter. The subtle sounds of wind across the tent fabric and occasional movements from the dogs provided a familiar soundtrack that actually helped Daniel sleep more soundly than he could in the relative silence of urban environments. What Daniel could not hear, even in the profound quiet of the Arctic night, was the nearly silent approach of 800 pounds of predator moving across the snow with the fluid grace that made polar bears such efficient killers. M47 had closed to within 200 meters of the campsite by midnight, pausing frequently to analyze scent trails and plan his approach. The bear's black nose, nearly 4 inches wide, processed an incredible array of information: the location and health status of each dog, Daniel's position in the tent, the age of various scent marks, and even dietary information that revealed what the dogs had been eating. The bear's approach demonstrated hunting behavior that was both instinctual and learned, passed down through generations of polar bears who had survived by successfully hunting prey that was often alert, dangerous, and capable of escaping across terrain where a single mistake could prove fatal. M47 moved in a series of careful advances, covering ground in short rushes, followed by extended periods of motionless observation. His white coat provided perfect camouflage against the snow, while his broad paws distributed his weight so effectively that he left barely detectable tracks. At approximately 0200 hours, the bear had positioned himself within 50 meters of the dog team, close enough to observe their sleeping positions and plan his attack. Polar bears are capable of explosive speed despite their massive size, able to accelerate from a standstill to over 40 kilometers per hour in just a few seconds. This combination of stealth and speed has evolved specifically to overcome prey that might otherwise escape into water or across terrain where the bear cannot follow. The dog's failure to detect the bear's presence until the final moments before the attack was not unusual, given the sophisticated hunting adaptations that polar bears have developed over millions of years of evolution. Unlike terrestrial predators who rely primarily on visual stalking, polar bears hunt prey that lives in a three-dimensional environment where scent and sound travel in complex patterns influenced by wind, temperature, and terrain. M47's approach from downwind eliminated scent detection, while his careful movement minimized ground vibration that might alert sleeping prey. At 03:47 hours on July 7, 2024, Bear M47 made his final approach toward the dog team, moving in the low crouch that polar bears adopt when closing distance with prey. His massive head swung slowly from side to side as he processed final sensory information, calculating distances and identifying his primary target. The bear's decision-making process was based on predatory algorithms refined by evolutionary pressure over millions of years, selecting for behaviors that maximized hunting success while minimizing energy expenditure and risk of injury. The first indication that something was wrong came from Luna, whose exceptional senses detected some combination of scent, sound, or vibration that triggered an immediate alarm response. The female husky's distinctive warning bark shattered the Arctic silence at exactly 03:49 hours, a sound that was simultaneously transmitted through the snow to sleeping dogs and through the air to Daniel's tent 50 meters away. Luna's warning was followed within seconds by responding barks from Thunder and Bear, creating a cascade of alarm calls that indicated immediate and serious danger. Daniel's response to the dog's alarm was instantaneous and automatic, the result of years of training and experience in environments where hesitation could prove fatal. He was fully awake and reaching for his rifle before the echoes of Luna's first bark had faded across the landscape. His movements inside the tent were smooth and efficient despite the bulky clothing and confined space, reflecting countless hours of practice in emergency procedures. The rifle was in his hands and loaded with a round in the chamber within 15 seconds of the first alarm. The sounds, coming from the direction of the dog team, were unlike anything Daniel had heard in 2 decades of Arctic travel. The normal barking that accompanied minor disturbances was replaced by frantic yelping and snarling that indicated life-threatening danger. Mixed with the dog's cries was a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. The roar of a massive polar bear announcing his dominance over prey that had no hope of escape. The sound was so deep and powerful that Daniel felt it as much as heard it, a physical vibration that seemed to penetrate his chest and trigger every survival instinct encoded in human DNA. Daniel's emergence from the tent into the Arctic night was hampered by the need to maintain equipment security while moving as quickly as possible toward the source of the disturbance. The temperature differential between the relatively warm tent interior and the -31-degree outside air caused his breath to form an immediate fog cloud that obscured his vision for several critical seconds. His first clear view of the situation came as he rounded a wind-carved ridge that had blocked his line of sight to the dog team's position. What Daniel saw in the pale light of the Arctic night was a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A massive polar bear, larger than any wild animal he had ever encountered, was in the midst of the dog team, with Luna clenched in his jaws. The bear's size was almost incomprehensible. Standing on his hind legs, he would have exceeded 10 feet in height, with a chest circumference that suggested a weight approaching 800 pounds. His coat was the pale yellow-white of an adult male in prime condition, marked with darker stains that Daniel realized with horror were blood from his dogs. Thunder and Bear, the two largest dogs in the team, had positioned themselves between the polar bear and their packmates, displaying the protective behavior that Daniel had carefully cultivated over years of training. Both dogs were barking and snarling with a ferocity that would have intimidated any brown bear or wolf, but their 90-pound frames were dwarfed by the massive predator they faced. The polar bear seemed almost amused by their defiance, shifting Luna's body in his jaws while maintaining eye contact with the dogs who dared to challenge him. The remaining dogs had scattered according to their individual personalities and training. Scout, with his wolf genetics providing superior survival instincts, had immediately sought cover behind the overturned sled, his body pressed low to the snow in a posture that suggested he understood the futility of direct confrontation. Frost and Storm had clustered together approximately 20 meters from the main confrontation, their body language indicating they were torn between flight and pack loyalty. Arctic and Blaze, the two youngest members of the team, had fled toward Daniel's position but were still 50 meters away from any meaningful protection. Daniel's first instinct was to shoot immediately, but his training and experience overruled the emotional response that demanded instant action. At a distance of nearly 80 meters in poor light conditions, with dogs scattered throughout the potential line of fire, the risk of hitting one of his own animals was unacceptably high. The .300 Winchester Magnum was capable of accurate shooting at this distance, but only under controlled conditions that bore no resemblance to the chaos unfolding before him. Instead of shooting, Daniel began moving rapidly toward the confrontation while shouting commands designed to recall the scattered dogs to his position. His voice, trained to carry across Arctic distances and penetrate the noise of running dogs and howling wind, was clearly audible to both the bear and the remaining dogs. Thunder immediately responded to Daniel's commands, beginning to disengage from his confrontation with the polar bear and moving toward his master's voice. Bear, the large Eskimo dog, hesitated for several seconds before also beginning to retreat, his breeding and training warring with instincts that demanded he protect his packmates. The polar bear's response to Daniel's presence was immediate and chilling. Rather than retreating in the face of human intervention, M47 dropped Luna's body and turned his full attention to this new threat. His posture changed from the relaxed dominance display he had shown to the dogs to the focused intensity of a predator evaluating new prey. The bear's head lowered and his ears flattened against his skull, body language that wildlife experts recognize as indicating an imminent attack. Daniel's movement toward the confrontation had closed the distance to approximately 60 meters when he realized that his intervention had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the situation. Instead of a predator focused on prey animals that he could easily dominate, the polar bear was now facing a human who represented an unknown threat level. Unfortunately, Daniel's presence had also made him the primary target, with consequences that would unfold over the next few minutes in a sequence of events that demonstrated why polar bears are considered the most dangerous land predators in North America. The bear's charge began with deceptive slowness, a loping gait that covered ground efficiently while allowing him to maintain visual contact with his target. Daniel had seen film footage of charging polar bears, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of nearly half a ton of muscle and bone moving directly toward him with obvious lethal intent. The bear's speed increased dramatically as he closed distance, reaching an estimated 40 kilometers per hour within seconds and continuing to accelerate. Daniel's first shot was fired at a distance of approximately 50 meters, aimed at the center of the bear's chest in hope of hitting vital organs that would stop the charge before the animal reached him. The .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge delivered nearly 4,000 foot-pounds of energy, more than enough to drop any North American game animal with proper shot placement. The bullet struck the bear high in the chest, penetrating deep into muscle and tissue, but failed to hit any immediately vital structures. The bear's response to being shot was a roar of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Daniel's feet. Rather than stopping or slowing the charge, the wound appeared to increase the animal's determination to reach his target. Daniel's second shot, fired at 30 meters, struck the bear in the shoulder, again delivering massive energy, but failing to achieve the immediate incapacitation that the situation demanded. At 20 meters, Daniel realized with crystal clarity that his rifle was not going to stop the charging bear before the animal reached him. His training took over, and he dove sideways toward the overturned sled, where Scout was already taking cover. The sled, constructed from aircraft aluminum and designed to carry heavy loads, represented the only available protection in terrain that offered no trees, rocks, or other natural barriers. Daniel's dive carried him behind the sled, just as the polar bear reached his previous position. The bear's momentum carried him past Daniel's location, but the massive predator was able to pivot with surprising agility for such a large animal. Daniel found himself wedged between the overturned sled and a small drift of wind-packed snow, with Scout pressed against his side and the polar bear beginning another approach from just 10 meters away. The confined space behind the sled allowed Daniel to bring his rifle to bear more effectively, and his third shot was fired at nearly point-blank range into the bear's face and neck area. This shot achieved better results, causing significant damage to the animal's skull and neck vertebrae. But polar bears are legendary for their to absorb damage that would immediately kill other animals. M47 staggered from the impact but continued his advance, now bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, but still fully capable of killing both Daniel and the dog. What followed was a desperate close-quarters battle that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but seemed to Daniel like hours. The polar bear's attempts to reach him were frustrated by the aluminum sled, which proved surprisingly effective as a barrier, despite never being designed for such use. Daniel was able to fire 2 additional shots at extremely close range, both hitting vital areas, and finally beginning to have the cumulative effect necessary to stop such a massive predator. The bear's final moments were a testament to the incredible toughness that allows polar bears to survive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Even with multiple bullet wounds, including damage to his heart and lungs, M47 continued trying to reach Daniel for nearly a full minute after what should have been immediately fatal injuries. His death was not the quick collapse often portrayed in movies, but a gradual weakening that finally ended when massive blood loss made continued aggression impossible. When the immediate danger finally passed, Daniel remained pressed against the overturned sled for several minutes, his rifle ready and his attention focused on the motionless form of the polar bear. Scout, who had remained pressed against Daniel throughout the encounter, was trembling but appeared physically uninjured. The silence that followed the bear's death was profound, broken only by Daniel's ragged breathing and the distant whimpering of the surviving dogs. The aftermath of the attack revealed the true scope of the tragedy that had unfolded in just a few minutes of Arctic night. Luna's body lay where the bear had dropped her, her neck clearly broken by the massive predator's jaws. The sight of the female husky's motionless form struck Daniel like a physical blow, representing not just the loss of a valuable working animal, but the death of a companion who had shared thousands of kilometers of Arctic travel and had trusted him to keep her safe. Moving carefully around the bear's body, Daniel began searching for the other members of his team. Thunder approached cautiously, limping slightly from what appeared to be a minor injury to his left rear leg, but otherwise unharmed. Bear, the large Eskimo dog, emerged from cover with what appeared to be claw marks across his shoulder, evidence of a close encounter with the predator during the initial moments of the attack. The search for the remaining dogs revealed the full extent of the night's tragedy. Storm was found approximately 30 meters from the main battle site, her body showing evidence of the massive trauma that polar bear attacks inflict on smaller prey animals. Arctic had fled further from the confrontation, but had been pursued and killed by the bear during the early phases of the attack. Frost was discovered near the original sleeping area, apparently killed while trying to protect Blaze, whose small body was found nearby. Of the 8 dogs that had begun the expedition, only 3 had survived: Thunder, Bear, and Scout. The loss of 5 team members represented not only a personal tragedy for Daniel, but also a logistical disaster that would make completing the expedition impossible. More immediately, the surviving dogs were traumatized and injured, requiring immediate medical attention that Daniel was not equipped to provide in the field. Daniel's emergency communication with the RCMP detachment in Resolute Bay came at 0427 hours, approximately 40 minutes after the initial attack. The satellite phone call was logged by Constable Harrison, who was working the night shift, and immediately recognized the severity of the situation from Daniel's voice and initial report. The call lasted nearly 15 minutes, during which Daniel provided a detailed account of the attack, his current status, the condition of surviving team members, and his immediate needs for emergency evacuation. The response to Daniel's emergency call involved multiple agencies and demonstrated the effectiveness of Arctic search and rescue procedures that have been refined through decades of experience with life-threatening emergencies in remote locations. Constable Harrison immediately activated the Canadian Armed Forces Search and Rescue Coordination Centre in Trenton, Ontario, which began coordinating aircraft deployment even before Daniel's initial call was completed. Within 2 hours of the emergency call, a CC-130 Hercules aircraft from 435 Transport and Rescue Squadron was airborne from CFB Winnipeg, carrying a specialized search and rescue team equipped for Arctic operations. The aircraft was crewed by personnel with extensive Arctic experience, including Flight Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to Daniel's mother despite the shared surname, a pilot with over 2,000 hours of Arctic flying experience, and Master Corporal James Whitehorse, a search and rescue technician whose own heritage included traditional Inuit survival skills. The complexity of the rescue operation was compounded by weather conditions that had deteriorated significantly since Daniel's emergency call. Winds had increased to nearly 50 kilometers per hour, creating ground blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. More critically, the wind chill had dropped to minus 47 degrees Celsius, approaching the threshold where exposed flesh can freeze in less than 5 minutes, and rescue operations become extremely dangerous for all involved. Daniel's survival during the hours between his emergency call and the arrival of rescue aircraft required every bit of Arctic experience he had accumulated over 2 decades of wilderness travel. His first priority was treating the injuries sustained by his surviving dogs, using veterinary supplies from his expedition medical kit to clean and bandage wounds while providing pain medication and antibiotics to prevent infection. Thunder's leg injury proved to be a deep laceration that required suturing, a procedure that Daniel performed by headlamp in the deteriorating weather conditions. The second major challenge was disposing of the polar bear's carcass in a manner that would not attract other predators to the area. Arctic wildlife regulations required that the bear be left undisturbed pending investigation by territorial wildlife officials, but Daniel's immediate safety required moving the body away from his survival position. Using a combination of rope and mechanical advantage provided by his sled rigging, Daniel was able to drag the 800-pound carcass approximately 50 meters downwind from his shelter location. Shelter construction became critical as weather conditions continued to deteriorate and rescue operations were delayed by visibility problems that prevented aircraft from locating Daniel's position. Using techniques learned from Inuit elders, Daniel constructed an emergency snow shelter that could accommodate himself and the 3 surviving dogs while providing protection from wind and cold that was now life-threatening even for someone with his experience and equipment. The snow shelter, known as a quinzhee, required nearly 3 hours to construct under the deteriorating conditions. Daniel first created a dome-shaped pile of snow, approximately 3 meters in diameter and 2 meters high, allowing it to settle and harden for an hour before beginning excavation. The interior was carefully carved to provide sleeping platforms raised above the floor level, preventing cold air from pooling around the occupants. Ventilation holes were critical to prevent carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining thermal efficiency. Inside the completed shelter, temperatures stabilized at approximately minus 10 degrees Celsius, nearly 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, and warm enough to prevent hypothermia with proper clothing and shared body heat from the dogs. Daniel's survival gear included emergency food supplies designed to provide maximum calories in minimum weight, consisting primarily of high-fat nuts, dried meat, and chocolate specifically formulated for Arctic conditions. Water procurement required constant attention in the sub-zero environment. Daniel melted snow using his emergency stove system, but the process consumed precious fuel while producing relatively small amounts of water. Conservation became critical, with all water carefully rationed between human and canine needs. The dog's higher metabolic rate and smaller body mass made them more susceptible to dehydration, particularly given the stress and injuries they had sustained during the attack. The psychological impact of the night's events began to manifest as Daniel settled into survival mode during the long hours awaiting rescue. The loss of 5 dogs represented the destruction of years of careful breeding, training, and relationship building. More profoundly, each dog had been an individual companion with its own personality, quirks, and role in the pack hierarchy. Luna's death was particularly devastating, as she had been not only a working partner, but a friend whose intelligence and loyalty had made her irreplaceable. Survivor's guilt began to torment Daniel as he replayed the night's events, questioning every decision and wondering if different choices might have saved more of the team. His rational mind understood that polar bear attacks are nearly impossible to survive without casualties, but his emotional response was dominated by feelings of responsibility and failure. The surviving dogs seemed to sense his distress, with Thunder and Bear maintaining closer physical contact than their normal pack behavior would dictate. The rescue operation resumed at 0847 hours, when improved weather conditions allowed the CC-130 Hercules to begin search patterns over Daniel's last known position. The aircraft was equipped with sophisticated thermal imaging and communications equipment designed specifically for Arctic search operations. But locating a single person in thousands of square kilometers of identical-looking terrain remained an enormous challenge, even with modern technology. Daniel's role in the search involved maintaining regular radio contact with the aircraft while deploying signaling devices designed to increase his visibility to rescue crews. Orange smoke flares provided visual references that could be seen from great distances, while strobe lights and radar reflectors helped guide aircraft to his precise location. The most effective signaling tool proved to be a large orange tarp that Daniel spread on the snow surface, creating a stark contrast visible from several kilometers away. First visual contact between the rescue aircraft and Daniel's position came at 0923 hours, when Flight Lieutenant Chen spotted the orange tarp during a low-altitude search pass. The sighting was immediately confirmed through radio contact, allowing the aircraft to begin coordination for the actual rescue operation. However, landing the CC-130 Hercules near Daniel's position was impossible due to terrain conditions, requiring deployment of specialized search and rescue technicians by parachute. Master Corporal Whitehorse's parachute deployment at 0945 hours represented a level of skill and courage that exemplifies Canadian military search and rescue operations. Jumping from 1,200 feet into Arctic conditions with winds gusting to 40 kilometers per hour required exceptional technical competence and physical conditioning. His landing was executed perfectly, bringing him to within 200 meters of Daniel's position with full medical and evacuation equipment. The reunion between Daniel and his rescuer was emotional for both men, representing the successful conclusion of a life-threatening emergency that had stretched on for nearly 6 hours. Master Corporal Whitehorse's first priority was medical assessment of both Daniel and the surviving dogs, checking for hypothermia, frostbite, and other injuries that might have occurred during the prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. Daniel's physical condition was remarkably good considering his ordeal, with only minor frostbite on 2 fingers of his left hand and some dehydration that could be easily treated. The surviving dogs presented more serious medical concerns, with Thunder's leg wound requiring immediate attention and all 3 animals showing signs of severe psychological trauma that would require specialized veterinary care. Bear's shoulder injuries were cleaned and bandaged, while Scout appeared physically uninjured but was displaying behavioral changes consistent with severe stress. The logistics of evacuating 4 individuals, 1 human and 3 dogs, from a remote Arctic location required careful planning and coordination between the rescue technician and aircraft crew. A specialized evacuation sled was deployed by parachute, designed to carry injured personnel safely across rough terrain to a suitable aircraft landing site approximately 2 kilometers from Daniel's shelter location. Transportation of the deceased polar bear required coordination with territorial wildlife authorities, who determined that the carcass should be recovered for scientific examination and legal documentation of the attack. The bear's body was loaded onto a separate cargo sled and would be transported to a research facility in Yellowknife for necropsy and analysis. This examination would provide valuable data about polar bear condition, behavior, and the factors that led to the attack. The evacuation convoy's movement across 2 kilometers of Arctic terrain took nearly 90 minutes, hampered by deteriorating weather conditions and the need to transport injured animals without causing additional trauma. Daniel remained on skis, providing navigation and emotional support to the dogs, while Master Corporal Whitehorse managed the evacuation sleds and maintained radio contact with the orbiting aircraft. The improvised landing strip, where the CC-130 Hercules would pick up the evacuation party, had been identified through aerial reconnaissance and prepared by the aircraft crew using specialized equipment designed for Arctic operations. The strip was approximately 800 meters long and had been cleared of major snowdrifts and marked with reflective markers visible to the pilots during their approach. Loading procedures for the aircraft required additional time due to the unusual nature of the cargo, with special attention given to securing the traumatized dogs in a manner that would keep them calm during the flight while ensuring their safety in case of turbulence or emergency maneuvering. The deceased polar bear's carcass was loaded in the aircraft's cargo bay using mechanical lifting equipment operated by the crew. Takeoff from the improvised Arctic landing strip at 12:47 hours marked the official end of Daniel's ordeal and the beginning of his transition back to the world of medical care, official investigations, and media attention that would define the next phase of his experience. The flight to Yellowknife would take approximately 2 hours, during which Daniel would receive additional medical evaluation and begin the psychological decompression process that follows traumatic survival situations. During the flight, Master Corporal Whitehorse conducted a detailed debriefing with Daniel, recording information that would be essential for official reports and future safety recommendations. The debriefing covered everything from the expedition planning and preparation through the attack itself and Daniel's survival strategies during the rescue wait. This information would later prove invaluable for improving Arctic safety protocols and training programs. The surviving dogs were monitored continuously during the flight by crew members with veterinary training, receiving IV fluids to combat dehydration and medications to manage pain and anxiety. Thunder's leg wound was re-examined and stabilized for transport to the veterinary facility in Yellowknife, while Bear and Scout were observed for signs of internal injuries or delayed shock responses that sometimes follow traumatic encounters. Daniel's emotional state during the flight fluctuated between relief at his rescue and grief over the loss of his team members. The reality of Luna's death in particular seemed to hit him with renewed force once the immediate survival crisis was over and he had time to process the night's events. Crew members provided both practical and emotional support, understanding that survival situations often produce delayed psychological reactions that can be as challenging as the original emergency. The aircraft's arrival at Yellowknife Airport at 14:56 hours on July 7th triggered a carefully coordinated response involving medical personnel, veterinary specialists, wildlife officials, and media representatives. An ambulance was standing by to transport Daniel to Stanton Territorial Hospital for comprehensive medical evaluation, while a specialized veterinary team from the territorial government was prepared to assume care of the surviving dogs. Rebecca Martinez Peters had arrived at the hospital 2 hours before the aircraft's scheduled landing, having been notified of the emergency through official channels and provided with regular updates on Daniel's condition throughout the rescue operation. Her professional medical background helped her understand and cope with the clinical aspects of Daniel's ordeal, but her emotional response as a wife was more difficult to manage. The reunion between Daniel and Rebecca in the hospital emergency department was captured by news photographers who had been granted limited access to document the story, images that would later appear in newspapers and magazines across Canada and internationally. The couple's embrace conveyed the profound relief and emotion that marked the end of Daniel's survival ordeal and his return to safety and family. Dr. Margaret Chen, the emergency physician who conducted Daniel's initial medical evaluation, found him to be in remarkably good condition considering his ordeal. His core body temperature was normal, blood pressure and heart rate were within acceptable ranges, and his mental status showed no signs of hypothermia or other cold-related injuries. The frostbite on his left hand was classified as superficial and was expected to heal completely with proper treatment. The psychological evaluation that accompanied Daniel's medical examination was conducted by Dr. Robert Taylor, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma responses related to survival situations and animal attacks. Dr. Taylor's assessment indicated that Daniel was experiencing normal acute stress responses to the traumatic events, including survivors' guilt, intrusive memories of the attack, and anxiety about the fate of his injured dogs. Treatment recommendations included both immediate and long-term components designed to help Daniel process the traumatic experience while preventing the development of more serious psychological conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Immediate treatment focused on rest, nutrition, and emotional support from family and friends, while longer-term therapy would address the complex emotions surrounding the loss of his dogs and his own survival. The veterinary team's evaluation of the surviving dogs was conducted at the Territorial Government's Wildlife Research Facility, where specialized equipment and expertise were available for treating large working animals. Dr. Patricia Blackstone, the territorial veterinarian, led the team that would provide ongoing care for Thunder, Bear, and Scout during their recovery from both physical injuries and psychological trauma. Thunder's leg wound required surgical repair to properly align damaged muscles and tendons, a procedure that was complicated by the dog's stress level and the need to minimize additional trauma. The surgery was successful, but full recovery would require several months of careful rehabilitation and physical therapy. Pain management protocols were established to keep the large Malamute comfortable while his tissues healed. Bear's shoulder injuries were less severe but required ongoing wound care and antibiotic treatment to prevent infection. The Eskimo dog's stoic temperament made him an easier patient than Thunder, but he also showed signs of behavioral changes that suggested he was processing the traumatic events in his own way. Veterinary behaviorists would work with him to address anxiety and aggression issues that sometimes developed following predator attacks. Scout's lack of physical injuries made him the easiest to treat medically, but his psychological responses were perhaps the most complex of the three survivors. His wolf genetics may have provided survival advantages during the attack, but they also contributed to behavioral changes that included increased wariness, reluctance to eat, and avoidance of human contact. Specialized handling techniques developed for working with wolf-dog hybrids would be necessary for his recovery. The investigation into the polar bear attack was initiated immediately upon Daniel's rescue, involving multiple agencies with different areas of expertise and responsibility. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police conducted a criminal investigation to determine whether any laws had been violated, while territorial wildlife authorities examined the biological and environmental factors that contributed to the attack. Constable Michael Harrison, who had reviewed Daniel's expedition plan and taken his emergency call, served as the primary RCMP investigator for the incident. His report would examine Daniel's preparation, equipment, emergency procedures, and response to the attack to determine whether proper protocols had been followed and whether any changes to regulations or procedures were warranted. The wildlife investigation was led by Dr. Amanda Russell, a polar bear specialist with the territorial government who had been studying Arctic predator behavior for over 15 years. Her team's analysis would focus on the bear's condition, behavior, and the environmental factors that brought him into contact with Daniel's expedition. The radio collar data from Bear M47 would provide crucial information about his movements and condition in the weeks leading up to the attack. Preliminary findings from the investigation indicated that Daniel had followed all established safety protocols and that his equipment and procedures met or exceeded territorial standards for Arctic expeditions. The attack appeared to be an unfortunate encounter with a nutritionally stressed polar bear that had been driven inland by ice conditions beyond Daniel's control or ability to predict. The bear's necropsy, conducted by Dr. Russell's team in collaboration with university researchers, revealed the extent of nutritional stress that had driven M47 to attack the dog team. The bear's body weight was approximately 30% below normal for an adult male of his age, and tissue analysis showed metabolic changes consistent with prolonged fasting. These findings supported the theory that climate change and altered ice conditions were forcing polar bears into increasingly desperate situations. The radio collar data analysis revealed that M47 had traveled over 400 kilometers during the month preceding the attack, moving steadily inland as coastal ice conditions deteriorated. This movement pattern was consistent with bears that have been forced to abandon their preferred hunting grounds and search for alternative food sources. The collar had recorded the bear's location within 15 kilometers of Daniel's campsite for 3 consecutive days before the attack. Media coverage of the polar bear attack began within hours of Daniel's rescue and quickly grew into an international news story that highlighted both the dangers of Arctic travel and the broader environmental issues affecting polar bear populations. Initial reports focused on the dramatic aspects of the survival story, but coverage soon expanded to include discussions of climate change, wildlife management, and the challenges facing both polar bears and the people who share their environment. Television interviews with Daniel, conducted several days after his return to Yellowknife, provided a first-person account of the attack that captured public attention and generated widespread sympathy for both Daniel's ordeal and the loss of his dogs. His calm, articulate description of the events, combined with his obvious grief over the loss of his team members, created a powerful narrative that resonated with audiences across Canada and internationally. Rebecca's perspective as the spouse of someone who regularly undertakes dangerous expeditions added another dimension to the media coverage, highlighting the emotional toll that such activities take on families and the support systems that make them possible. Her interviews discussed the careful balance between supporting Daniel's passion for mushing and managing her own anxiety about his safety. The response from the mushing community was immediate and supportive, with fellow mushers from across North America offering both emotional support and practical assistance in rebuilding Daniel's team. Several experienced mushers offered dogs from their own teams, while others provided financial support for veterinary care and equipment replacement. This outpouring of support reflected the close-knit nature of the mushing community and their understanding of the profound bond between mushers and their dogs. Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge keepers provided additional perspective on the attack, placing it within the broader context of changing Arctic conditions and evolving relationships between humans and wildlife. Their insights emphasized the importance of maintaining traditional skills and knowledge while adapting to environmental changes that are occurring faster than ecosystems can naturally adjust. Scientific analysis of the attack provided valuable data for researchers studying polar bear behavior and the impacts of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. The detailed documentation of the bear's condition, behavior, and movement patterns contributed to ongoing research efforts aimed at understanding how environmental changes are affecting predator-prey relationships in the Arctic. The recovery process for Daniel and his surviving dogs extended over many months and involved ongoing medical care, psychological support, and gradual reintegration into normal activities. Daniel's physical recovery was relatively straightforward, with his frostbite healing completely within 6 weeks and no lasting physical effects from his ordeal. His psychological recovery proved more complex and ongoing. Post-traumatic stress symptoms emerged gradually over the weeks following the attack, including intrusive memories, sleep disturbances, and anxiety around situations that reminded him of the experience. Dr. Taylor's ongoing therapy sessions helped Daniel process these symptoms while developing coping strategies for managing his emotional responses to the trauma. The decision about whether to continue expedition mushing became a central focus of Daniel's recovery process. His love for the sport and the Arctic environment remained strong, but the traumatic loss of 5 team members raised fundamental questions about acceptable risk levels and his responsibilities to both his family and future dogs. These discussions involved not only Daniel and Rebecca, but also Emma, who at 5 years old was beginning to understand the dangerous nature of her father's activities. Thunder's physical recovery progressed well, with the Malamute regaining full use of his injured leg within 4 months of the attack. However, his behavior showed lasting changes that reflected his traumatic experience. He became more protective of Daniel and showed increased wariness around unfamiliar situations and people. These changes were not necessarily negative, but represented a permanent alteration in his personality and working characteristics. Bear's recovery followed a similar pattern, with his physical wounds healing completely but behavioral changes persisting. The Eskimo dog became more independent and less responsive to commands, traits that reflected both his traumatic experience and possibly some regression to more primitive behavioral patterns. Working with him required modified training techniques that acknowledged his changed relationship with humans. Scout's recovery was the most challenging of the 3 survivors, with his wolf genetics contributing to behavioral changes that made him unsuitable for continued work as a sled dog. His increased wariness and reduced trust in humans, while understandable given his experience, meant that he could no longer safely participate in expedition activities. Daniel made the difficult decision to retire Scout to a specialized facility that cares for wolf-dog hybrids. The legal aspects of the polar bear attack were relatively straightforward, as Daniel's actions in killing the bear were clearly justified under territorial wildlife regulations that permit the destruction of dangerous wildlife in defense of human life. However, the incident did prompt a review of safety regulations and emergency procedures for Arctic expeditions, resulting in several changes to territorial guidelines. New regulations implemented following the attack included enhanced communication requirements for solo expeditions, mandatory bear deterrent systems, and improved coordination between expedition leaders and search and rescue authorities. While these changes did not significantly alter the fundamental nature of Arctic travel, they provided additional safety margins that could prove crucial in future emergency situations. The financial impact of the attack was substantial, involving costs for emergency rescue operations, medical treatment, veterinary care, and equipment replacement. While insurance covered many of these expenses, Daniel faced significant out-of-pocket costs that were partially offset by donations from the mushing community and public supporters who had followed his story in the media. The broader implications of the attack extended beyond Daniel's personal experience to encompass larger questions about human-wildlife interactions in a changing Arctic environment. Climate change was clearly a contributing factor in bringing the nutritionally stressed polar bear into contact with Daniel's expedition, highlighting the increasing challenges facing both wildlife and people in the Arctic. Research initiatives spawned by the attack included enhanced monitoring of polar bear populations, improved tracking of sea ice conditions, and development of better early warning systems for wildlife encounters. These efforts represented attempts to reduce the likelihood of similar incidents, while maintaining the possibility for continued human use of Arctic wilderness areas. The educational value of Daniel's experience was recognized through his participation in safety training programs and public speaking engagements that shared lessons learned from the attack. His presentations emphasized the importance of proper preparation, emergency protocols, and respect for Arctic wildlife, while acknowledging that some risks cannot be completely eliminated. 1 year after the attack, Daniel made the decision to return to Expedition Mushing with a new team that included Thunder and Bear as the Foundation members. This decision represented the culmination of extensive therapy, family discussions, and careful consideration of modified safety protocols that incorporated lessons learned from his traumatic experience. The new expedition protocols included enhanced communication systems, additional bear deterrent devices, and modified route planning that avoided areas with high polar bear activity during times of year when nutritional stress was most likely. While these changes did not eliminate risk entirely, they represented reasonable precautions based on current knowledge and technology. Rebecca's acceptance of Daniel's return to expeditionary mushing reflected her understanding that this activity was fundamental to his identity and mental health. However, her support was conditional on continued adherence to enhanced safety protocols and regular evaluation of risk levels as Arctic conditions continued to change. Emma's participation in her father's decision-making process marked her growing understanding of the complex relationships between family life, professional activities, and personal fulfillment. At 6 years old, she was beginning to comprehend that her father's work involved real dangers, but also provided him with profound satisfaction and purpose. The memorial service for the 5 dogs killed in the attack was held 1 year after the incident, providing closure for Daniel and recognition of the animal's role in his survival. The service acknowledged that Luna, Storm, Arctic, Frost, and Blaze had died protecting their human companion, demonstrating the loyalty and courage that define the relationship between Mushers and their teams. The long-term impact of the July 7th polar bear attack extended far beyond Daniel's personal experience to influence Arctic safety protocols, wildlife management policies, and public understanding of the challenges facing both humans and animals in a rapidly changing environment. The incident served as a stark reminder of the risks inherent in Arctic travel, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of proper preparation, emergency procedures, and search and rescue capabilities. 5 years after the attack, Daniel continues to operate his mushing expeditions with Thunder, now 12 years old, serving as the elder statesman of a new generation of dogs, trained with enhanced safety protocols and deeper understanding of Arctic wildlife behavior. Bear, at 11 years old, remains an active member of the team, his experience and wisdom providing stability for younger dogs who have never faced a life-threatening predator encounter. The polar bear population monitoring programs initiated following the attack have provided valuable data about the ongoing challenges facing these magnificent predators as Arctic ice conditions continue to deteriorate. While individual attacks, like the one that claimed 5 of Daniel's dogs, remain relatively rare, the underlying environmental pressures that contributed to the incident continue to intensify. Climate change researchers now use Daniel's experience as a case study in the complex relationships between environmental change, wildlife behavior, and human activities in the Arctic. The incident demonstrates how global environmental changes can create local situations that dramatically affect individual lives, both human and animal. The July 7th attack stands as a powerful reminder that the Arctic remains one of Earth's most challenging environments, where survival depends on careful preparation, respect for natural forces, and acceptance that some risks cannot be completely eliminated. Daniel's survival and recovery represent human resilience and adaptability, while the loss of his 5 dogs serves as a sobering reminder of the costs that sometimes accompany life in the wilderness. The story of Daniel Peters and his team continues to evolve as Arctic conditions change and new challenges emerge. His experience has contributed to improved safety protocols, enhanced wildlife research, and greater public understanding of the complex relationships between humans, animals, and environment in one of the world's most demanding landscapes. The legacy of Luna, Storm, Arctic, Frost, and Blaze lives on in the enhanced safety measures that protect future expeditions and in the continued bond between mushers and their dogs, who share the risks and rewards of Arctic travel. The next stories. The Ice Station Incident. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her gloved hand against the reinforced glass window of the Qaanaaq Arctic Research Station, watching the endless expanse of ice stretch toward the horizon where the pale April sun hung low like a dying ember. The temperature gauge outside read -37 degrees Celsius, but inside the station's main laboratory, the steady hum of heating systems maintained a comfortable 20 degrees. She had been at the station for 6 weeks now, part of a 12-person team studying climate change effects on polar ice formations, and the isolation was beginning to wear on everyone. The Qaanaaq station sat on a strategic promontory overlooking the frozen Nares Strait, approximately 800 kilometers north of Thule Air Base and just 47 kilometers from the nearest Inuit settlement. Built in 2019 as a joint Canadian-Danish research facility, the station consisted of 3 interconnected modular buildings: the main laboratory and living quarters, the equipment storage facility, and the emergency shelter. Each building was elevated on reinforced steel pillars to prevent heat transfer to the permafrost below, and the entire complex was surrounded by a perimeter of motion sensor lights designed to deter curious wildlife. Dr. Chen, a glaciologist from the University of British Columbia, had spent the morning reviewing ice core samples with her research partner, Dr. Marcus Andersson, a Swedish climatologist whose weathered face and piercing blue eyes spoke of decades spent in the world's most unforgiving environments. At 53, Marcus was the oldest member of their team and had earned a reputation as one of the world's foremost experts on Arctic ecosystem dynamics. His presence at Qaanaaq was considered a coup for the research program. "The isotope ratios in these samples are unprecedented," Marcus said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the data on his laptop screen. "We're seeing temperature fluctuations that suggest the Greenland ice sheet is destabilizing faster than our models predicted." Sarah nodded, though her attention was divided between the data and the growing darkness outside. Even in April, the Arctic night came early and stayed late, and something about the quality of today's twilight felt different, more oppressive, more ominous. She had spent enough time in polar regions to trust her instincts about weather patterns and environmental changes, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that something was wrong. The research station's other occupants were scattered throughout the facility, each absorbed in their own specialized work. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist from Madrid, was in the wet lab analyzing water samples collected from beneath the ice sheet. Her assistant, Thomas Kim, a graduate student from Seoul National University, was helping her catalog microorganism specimens that could provide crucial data about the ocean's response to changing ice conditions. In the meteorology station, Dr. James Whitmore, an atmospheric physicist from Oxford, monitored weather patterns with the assistance of Lisa Morrison, a technician from the Canadian Meteorological Service. James, at 38, had already published groundbreaking research on Arctic wind patterns, while Lisa's 15 years of experience in remote weather monitoring made her invaluable for maintaining the station's sophisticated environmental sensors. The station's support staff consisted of 4 additional personnel: Robert Bear Kozlowski, a former Canadian Forces engineer who served as the facility's maintenance supervisor and emergency coordinator; Ingrid Larsen, a communications specialist and amateur photographer from Copenhagen; Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a geophysicist studying seismic activity related to ice movement; and Captain Frank O'Brien, an experienced bush pilot who maintained the station's emergency aircraft and served as their primary link to the outside world. Each member of the team had undergone extensive Arctic survival training before deployment, including protocols for wildlife encounters. Polar bears were a constant concern in this region, particularly during the spring months when sea ice conditions forced them to range farther inland in search of food. The station's emergency procedures manual, which every team member had memorized, contained detailed instructions for bear encounters: immediate retreat to secure areas, activation of emergency beacons, and deployment of deterrent measures including flares, air horns, and, if absolutely necessary, the 12-gauge shotgun kept locked in the emergency equipment cache. But as Dr. Chen stood at the window that April evening, watching the aurora borealis paint ghostly green curtains across the star-filled sky, she could not have imagined that within 6 hours those carefully rehearsed procedures would prove tragically inadequate against a force of nature that had evolved to survive in the world's most hostile environment. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47 p.m., when the station's perimeter motion sensors triggered a series of alerts in the main control room. Lisa Morrison, who was pulling the night shift monitoring meteorological data, initially dismissed the readings as false alarms caused by shifting snow or small Arctic foxes. The sensors had been installed to detect large animal movement, but the Arctic's extreme weather conditions occasionally caused them to malfunction. "Perimeter breach, Sector 7, the automated system announced in its calm electronic voice. Lisa glanced at the security monitor, which showed only empty darkness beyond the reach of the station's floodlights. She noted the alert in the station log and returned to her weather data, where atmospheric pressure readings suggested a significant storm system approaching from the northwest. What Lisa could not see, and what the motion sensors had detected, was a massive polar bear moving with deliberate purpose through the maze of equipment caches and supply containers scattered around the station's perimeter. The bear, a mature male weighing approximately 650 kilograms, had been tracking the scent of cooking food for over 3 hours. Driven by a hunger that had gnawed at him for weeks, as sea ice conditions made hunting impossible, he had traveled nearly 40 kilometers from his usual territory. Polar bears possess olfactory capabilities 50 times more sensitive than those of humans, capable of detecting seal-breathing holes beneath 2 meters of ice from distances exceeding 30 kilometers. The aroma of the evening's dinner, roasted chicken prepared by Dr. Vasquez, who had drawn cooking duty for the week, had reached him on the wind, triggering an irresistible compulsion to investigate. The bear's approach was methodical and intelligent. Unlike the popular misconception of polar bears as simple-minded predators, they are highly intelligent animals capable of complex problem-solving and tactical thinking. This particular bear had encountered human structures before, during a previous encounter with an abandoned research camp 2 years earlier, and had learned that such places often contained easily accessible food sources. Moving silently despite his massive size, the bear circled the station complex, testing the air currents and studying the layout of buildings and obstacles. His black nose, perfectly adapted for Arctic conditions, detected not only the scent of cooked food, but also the presence of 12 humans, their soap, their clothing, their exhaled breath condensing in the frigid air. To the bear, each human represented a potential source of food, though his primary focus remained on the easier target of stored provisions. At 12:23 a.m., the bear approached the main building's loading dock, where several containers of food supplies were stored in what the research team believed to be bear-proof containers. The metal containers, rated to withstand polar bear interference, were designed with complex locking mechanisms and reinforced construction. However, the bear's powerful claws and intelligent problem-solving abilities had defeated similar obstacles before. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the April night as the bear began his assault on the storage containers. The noise was subtle at first, barely audible above the constant hum of the station's generators and heating systems. Inside the facility, the 12 team members continued their work or slept peacefully, unaware that their carefully maintained isolation was about to be shattered by one of nature's most formidable predators. Dr. Tanaka, working late in the seismology lab, was the first to notice something unusual. Her sensitive equipment, designed to detect minute vibrations in the ice sheet, began registering rhythmic disturbances that didn't match any known geological patterns. The vibrations were too regular to be natural seismic activity, too strong to be caused by wind, and too localized to be distant ice movement. "That's strange," she murmured, adjusting the gain on her instruments. The seismograph displayed a series of sharp spikes occurring every few seconds, each one indicating a significant impact on the station's support structure. Yuki had seen similar patterns before during her previous work in Alaska, when a grizzly bear had attempted to break into a research cache. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. She reached for the intercom button to alert the rest of the team, but before she could activate it, the metallic scraping sounds intensified dramatically. The bear had succeeded in damaging the locking mechanism of one food container and was now attempting to pry it open with the full force of his powerful foreclaws. Each swipe of his paws against the metal created vibrations that traveled through the station's foundation and registered on Yuki's instruments like small earthquakes. The container finally gave way at 12:41 a.m., its metal lid tearing open with a screech that echoed across the Arctic landscape. Inside, the bear discovered a treasure trove of preserved foods, canned goods, dried fruits, packaged meals, and most appealingly, several sealed bags of frozen chicken that had been stored for the team's weekly rotation dinners. The discovery should have satisfied the bear's hunger and drawn him away from the station, but instead, it had the opposite effect. The taste of easily obtained food triggered a feeding frenzy that intensified the bear's determination to find more. Having learned that this location contained abundant food sources, he began a systematic search of the area, methodically investigating every potential cache and storage area around the station perimeter. His movements became more aggressive, more focused, and inevitably more dangerous to the humans sleeping peacefully inside the facility. Bear Kozlowski, whose nickname had proven ironically prophetic, was awakened from a deep sleep by the sound of metal being torn apart. As the station's emergency coordinator, Bear had trained for exactly this type of situation, and his military background had taught him to trust his instincts about potential threats. The metallic screaming from outside was unmistakably the sound of something powerful destroying their equipment. Rolling out of his bunk with practiced efficiency, Bear pulled on his insulated pants and boots, grabbed his parka, and retrieved the emergency radio from his bedside table. His first priority was to alert the rest of the team and implement the station's bear encounter protocols. Moving quietly to avoid startling anyone into panic, he made his way to the main communications center where Lisa Morrison continued her weather monitoring duties. "Lisa," he whispered urgently, "we've got a situation outside. I think we have a polar bear trying to get into our food stores." Lisa looked up from her instruments, her face pale in the glow of the computer screens. I heard some noise earlier and got a few motion sensor alerts, but I thought it was just wind or small wildlife. This is definitely not small wildlife, Bear replied grimly. I need you to activate the station-wide emergency alert system and wake everyone up. We need to implement lockdown procedures immediately. As Lisa reached for the emergency alert controls, a thunderous crash shook the entire station. The Bear had discovered a secondary food cache near the equipment storage building and had begun attacking it with increased ferocity. The sound was followed by the distinctive creak and groan of metal under extreme stress, suggesting that whatever the Bear was attacking was beginning to fail under his assault. The station-wide alarm system activated at 12:47 a.m., filling the facility with a piercing electronic wail that immediately awakened every sleeping team member. The sound was followed by Bear's voice over the intercom system. All personnel, this is an emergency. We have a polar bear on the premises attempting to access our food supplies. Implement immediate lockdown procedures. Do not attempt to go outside for any reason. Repeat, do not go outside. The response was immediate and professional. Each team member had drilled these procedures dozens of times during their pre-deployment training. Dr. Chen secured her laboratory equipment and retreated to the main building's central corridor, as did Dr. Anderson. Dr. Vasquez and Thomas Kim quickly shut down their wet lab operations and moved to join the others. Dr. Whitmore abandoned his meteorological monitoring station and hurried to the main building with Lisa Morrison. Captain O'Brien, whose pilot training had included extensive wildlife encounter protocols, immediately began preparing the station's emergency communication equipment to contact the authorities in Thule. Dr. Tanaka shut down her seismic monitoring equipment and brought her data on the Bear's movements to the main gathering area. Ingrid Larson activated the station's external cameras and floodlight systems, hoping to get visual confirmation of the threat and possibly discourage the Bear through bright illumination. The 12 team members gathered in the station's main corridor, a central hallway that provided access to all interior rooms and was considered the most secure area of the facility. Bear Kozlowski took charge of the situation, consulting the emergency procedures manual, while Captain O'Brien worked to establish communication with external authorities. According to protocol, our first priority is to secure all entrances and ensure the Bear cannot gain access to the interior, Bear announced to the assembled team. The station was designed to withstand polar bear intrusion, but we need to verify that all access points are properly secured. Dr. Chen found herself pressed against the corridor wall between Marcus Anderson and Elena Vasquez, acutely aware of how vulnerable they all were despite the station's robust construction. The building's walls were rated to withstand polar bear attacks, but she knew that determined bears had been known to find unexpected weak points in even the most carefully designed structures. "Visual confirmation," Ingrid called out from the monitoring station. "I've got the Bear on camera. He's approximately 3 meters from the main building near the loading dock. He's enormous." On the monitor screens, the team could see their uninvited visitor clearly for the first time. The polar bear was indeed massive, his cream-colored fur appearing almost luminescent under the station's floodlights. He moved with a combination of power and intelligence that was both magnificent and terrifying, methodically investigating every potential entrance to the building while showing no fear whatsoever of the bright lights or human presence. Estimated weight, 650 to 700 kilograms, Dr. Anderson observed quietly. That's a fully mature male, probably 8 to 10 years old. He's in excellent condition, which means he's been successful at hunting until recently. Thomas Kim, the youngest member of the team at only 24, watched the monitors with wide eyes. Why isn't he afraid of the lights? I thought polar bears usually avoided human contact. Not when they're this hungry, Dr. Vasquez replied. Spring is the most dangerous time for bear encounters. Sea ice conditions have been changing, making it harder for them to hunt seals. A bear this size needs to consume massive amounts of food to maintain his body weight, and if he's been unsuccessful hunting, he'll be desperate enough to take significant risks. Captain O'Brien looked up from the radio equipment with a grim expression. "I've made contact with Thule Air Base. They're aware of our situation, but weather conditions are preventing immediate aerial support. The storm system that's moving in has grounded all aircraft until further notice." The news sent a ripple of unease through the assembled team. Their emergency procedures had always assumed that outside help would be available within a few hours of any serious incident. The realization that they were completely on their own, with no possibility of evacuation or reinforcement, transformed their situation from a manageable emergency into a potentially deadly trap. "How long until the storm passes?" Dr. Whitmore asked, consulting his meteorological data on a portable tablet. "Best case scenario, 18 to 20 hours, Captain O'Brien replied. "Worst case, it could be 3 days before conditions improve enough for aircraft operations." The implications were clear to everyone. They would need to survive whatever the polar bear decided to do without any external assistance, relying entirely on the station's defensive capabilities and their own resourcefulness. The bear, meanwhile, continued his systematic exploration of the building's perimeter, testing doors, investigating windows, and demonstrating a level of intelligence and persistence that was deeply unsettling. At 1:15 a.m., the bear discovered the station's emergency exit on the building's north side. The exit was equipped with a heavy steel door designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, but the bear immediately recognized it as a potential access point. He began applying pressure to the door, first with his paws, then with his full body weight, testing the strength of the hinges and lock mechanism. "He's found the north emergency exit," Ingrid reported, her voice tight with anxiety. "The door is holding, but he's really putting pressure on it." Bear Kozlowski moved to examine the door from the inside, running his hands along the frame and checking the lock mechanism. The door had been designed to meet Arctic building standards, but those standards were intended primarily to deal with weather, not with a 650-kilogram predator specifically motivated to gain entry. "The door will hold," he announced with more confidence than he felt, "but we need to be prepared for the possibility that he might find a weakness we haven't anticipated. Everyone needs to remain calm and stay away from all exterior walls." As if responding to Bear's words, the polar bear outside intensified his attack on the emergency exit. The sound of his claws scraping against steel echoed through the building, accompanied by the rhythmic thudding of his massive body slamming against the door. Each impact caused the entire wall to vibrate, and small particles of ice and debris began falling from the ceiling where the wall met the roof structure. Dr. Tanaka, monitoring the situation through her seismic equipment, provided a running commentary on the bear's activities. "He's applying approximately 400 kilograms of force with each impact," she reported. "The doorframe is showing stress indicators, but it's still within acceptable parameters." The bear's assault continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which the 12 team members huddled in the main corridor, listening to the terrifying sounds of their shelter being systematically tested by one of nature's most powerful predators. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the immediate physical threat, knowing that only a few centimeters of steel and insulation separated them from those massive claws, and teeth created a level of anxiety that their training had not fully prepared them to handle. Finally, at 1:37 a.m., the bear abandoned his attack on the emergency exit and moved to investigate other potential access points. The sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the previous cacophony, leaving the team to wonder where he had gone and what he might be planning next. "Motion sensors indicate he's moved to the southeast corner of the building," Lisa reported, monitoring the detection system from the communication station. He's investigating the area around the generator housing. The generator housing was a critical concern. While the generators themselves were enclosed in a heavily reinforced shelter, the fuel lines and electrical connections that ran from the housing to the main building represented potential weak points in the station's defenses. If the bear damaged the generator system, they would lose heat, lighting, and most importantly, the ability to communicate with the outside world. "We need eyes on the generator area," Bear decided. "Ingrid, can you get camera coverage of that sector?" Ingrid worked her way through the camera control system, trying to position the external monitors to provide visual coverage of the generator housing. The station's security cameras had not been designed primarily for wildlife monitoring, and their coverage of the southeast sector was limited. "I'm getting partial coverage," she reported. "The bear is definitely in that area, but the angle isn't good enough to see exactly what he's doing." What the cameras could not show was that the polar bear had discovered something far more interesting than generator housing. His extraordinarily sensitive nose had detected a scent trail leading from the generator area toward a small auxiliary building that housed the station's emergency supplies and backup communication equipment. More importantly, the building also contained additional food stores that had been placed there as a backup in case the main storage areas were compromised. The auxiliary building had been constructed to the same standards as the main facility, but it was smaller and less robust, designed primarily to house equipment rather than to serve as a refuge for humans. The bear approached it with the same methodical intelligence he had displayed throughout his exploration, testing doors, examining windows, and searching for any weakness that might allow him access to the tantalizing scents emanating from within. At 1:52 a.m., he found what he was looking for. The auxiliary building's ventilation system included an external air intake that had been designed to prevent the intrusion of snow and debris, but not specifically to exclude a determined polar bear. The intake cover was secured with standard bolts that were no match for the bear's powerful claws, and within minutes he had torn it away completely. The sound of rending metal carried clearly across the frozen landscape and into the main building, where the research team listened with growing alarm. Bear Kozlowski immediately recognized the implications of what they were hearing. "He's found a way into the auxiliary building," he announced grimly. "If he gets into our backup supplies, we could lose critical emergency equipment." Nadi. The auxiliary building contained not only additional food stores, but also backup communication equipment, emergency medical supplies, and most critically, the station's emergency beacon that would automatically signal their location to rescue authorities if the main communication systems failed. Losing access to that equipment could transform their current crisis into a genuine survival situation. "What are our options?" Dr. Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "According to protocol, we do not leave the main building under any circumstances when a polar bear is active in the area," Bear replied. "The risk to human life is too great to justify protecting equipment no matter how important." The decision was sound from a safety standpoint, but it left them feeling helpless as they listened to the bear systematically destroying their backup resources. The sounds from the auxiliary building suggested that he had successfully gained entry and was now exploring the interior, undoubtedly drawn by the scent of the additional food supplies stored there. Captain O'Brien continued his efforts to maintain communication with Thule Air Base, providing regular updates on their situation and requesting any advice or assistance that might be available despite the weather conditions. The responses were supportive, but essentially useless. The storm system that was moving in had effectively isolated them from any meaningful outside help. "Thule acknowledges our situation and has placed rescue assets on standby," he reported to the group. but they're estimating a minimum of 18 hours before weather conditions allow helicopter operations, and that's assuming the storm doesn't intensify beyond current projections. 18 hours suddenly seemed like an eternity. The team had already been dealing with the bear's presence for over 2 hours, and the psychological strain was beginning to show. Thomas Kim, the youngest and least experienced member of the team, was visibly shaking despite the warm temperature inside the building. Dr. Vasquez had taken responsibility for monitoring his condition, concerned that panic could lead to poor decisions that might endanger everyone. "The bear's been in the auxiliary building for almost 15 minutes, Ingrid observed, tracking the time since the last sounds of destruction had reached them. "Maybe he found enough food to satisfy him and he'll move on." It was a hopeful thought, but Dr. Anderson's expression suggested he didn't share that optimism. "Polar bears are opportunistic feeders," he explained quietly. "If he's found one easy source of food, his instinct will be to search for more. The longer he stays in this area, the more likely he is to view it as his territory." As if summoned by Anderson's words, new sounds began to emerge from outside the main building. The bear had indeed found substantial food supplies in the auxiliary building, but rather than satisfying his hunger, the discovery had only reinforced his belief that this location contained abundant resources worth defending and exploiting. The sounds were different now, not the systematic testing and probing they had heard earlier, but the confident movements of a predator who had claimed a territory. The bear was moving around the perimeter of the main building with purposeful deliberation, no longer searching for weaknesses, but rather asserting his dominance over the area. "He's not leaving," Bear Kozlowski observed unnecessarily. "He's settling in for an extended stay." The implications were sobering. Rather than being a brief encounter that would end when the bear moved on to other hunting grounds, their situation was evolving into a siege. The polar bear had identified their location as a valuable resource and was prepared to defend it against any challenges to his claim. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's seismic equipment continued to track the bear's movements around the building, providing a real-time map of his location. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. The bear was learning the layout of the facility, memorizing the location of doors, windows, and other potential access points. His intelligence was being applied to the problem of how to gain entry to the main building, and each circuit he made around the perimeter brought him closer to finding a solution. At 2:31 a.m., the bear returned to the north emergency exit and resumed his assault on the door with renewed vigor. However, his approach was different now, more focused, more technically sophisticated. Instead of simply applying brute force to the entire door, he was concentrating his efforts on specific areas where his investigation had revealed potential weaknesses. "The door frame is showing increased stress," Yuki reported, monitoring the vibrations through her equipment. "He's targeting the upper hinge area specifically. That's actually the weakest point in the door's design." The realization that the bear was capable of such sophisticated tactical thinking sent a chill through the assembled team that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold outside. They were not dealing with a simple predator operating on instinct alone, but with an intelligent adversary who was actively learning and adapting his strategy. The assault on the emergency exit continued for another 37 minutes, during which the team listened to the progressive deterioration of their defenses. The sound of metal fatigue was clearly audible now, and small stress fractures were beginning to appear in the door frame where the bear was concentrating his attacks. "We need to prepare for the possibility that the door might fail," Bear announced to the group. "Everyone needs to know where the emergency equipment is located and what our backup plans are if he gains entry." DC, the emergency equipment cache, was located in a reinforced closet near the main corridor, containing flares, air horns, bear spray, and the 12-gauge shotgun that represented their last line of defense. Bear unlocked the cache and began distributing equipment to team members, though everyone understood that their options would be extremely limited if it came to a direct confrontation with a 650-kilogram polar bear inside the confined space of the building. "Remember," Bear emphasized as he handed out flares and air horns, "polar bears can be deterred by loud noises and bright lights, but only if they're not too committed to their course of action. If he's determined enough to break through our defenses, these deterrents might not be effective." The unspoken implication was that the shotgun might be their only reliable option, but using a firearm against a polar bear inside a confined space would create its own set of dangers. The risk of ricochets, the limited effectiveness of shotgun pellets against the bear's thick hide and massive bone structure, and the possibility of injury to team members in the chaotic conditions of an indoor confrontation made it a weapon of last resort. At 3:08 a.m., the inevitable happened. The repeated stress from the polar bear's attacks finally overcame the emergency exit door's structural integrity. The upper hinge failed with a metallic scream that echoed through the building, followed immediately by the sound of the massive door crashing to the floor. "The door is down," Ingrid announced unnecessarily, her voice tight with controlled panic. "He's got access to the building." For a moment an eerie silence settled over the station. The bear had achieved his objective of gaining entry, but he was now in unfamiliar territory. The warm air from inside the building carried human scents that were much stronger than anything he had encountered outside, along with the complex aromas of cooking, cleaning supplies, and the various chemicals used in scientific research. The silence was broken by the sound of massive paws moving carefully across the linoleum floor of the station's north corridor. The bear was inside, and he was exploring his new environment with the same methodical intelligence he had displayed throughout his siege of the facility. "Everyone stay calm," Bear whispered urgently. "Move quietly toward the main communications center. We need to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and the breach point." The 12 team members began a careful retreat deeper into the building, moving as quietly as possible while the bear continued his exploration of the north corridor. The station's interior layout worked in their favor. The building had been designed with multiple rooms and hallways that would limit the bears to corner them in a single location. Dr. Chen found herself near the rear of the group, pressed close to Marcus Anderson and Elena Vasquez as they made their way toward the communications center. Every step seemed to echo impossibly loudly in the tense silence, and she could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. The abstract knowledge that polar bears were dangerous predators was very different from the reality of sharing a building with one. The bear's exploration of the North Corridor was thorough and systematic. He investigated each room he encountered, pushing open doors with his massive head and using his extraordinary sense of smell to catalogue the contents of each space. The sounds of his movement, the soft padding of his paws, the occasional scrape of claws against walls, the quiet huffing of his breathing, created a terrifying soundtrack that followed the team as they retreated. "He's in the equipment storage room," Yuki whispered, tracking the bear's location through her acoustic monitoring equipment. "He's spending a lot of time in there, probably investigating scents." The equipment storage room contained various scientific instruments, spare parts for the station's systems, and most appealingly to the bear, several containers of lubricants and cleaning supplies that had absorbed food odors from their proximity to the kitchen area. The bear's investigation of these containers was creating a series of crashes and scraping sounds that suggested he was becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to access the tantalizing scents. "Is there any food in that room?" Bear asked quietly. "No significant food stores," Dr. Whitmore replied, "but there are containers that might smell like food to him. If he can't find what he's looking for, he might become more aggressive in his searching." The prediction proved accurate. After spending nearly 10 minutes investigating the equipment storage room, the bear emerged and began a more aggressive exploration of the corridor. His movements became faster and less cautious, and the sounds of his search took on a more destructive character as he began forcing his way through doors and obstacles. At 3:27 a.m., the bear discovered the station's main laboratory, where Dr. Chen and Dr. Anderson had been working earlier that evening. The laboratory contained various chemical odors that were completely unfamiliar to the bear, along with the lingering scent of the coffee that Marcus had brewed during his late-night work session. The bear's investigation of the laboratory was thorough and destructive. Scientific equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was scattered across the floor as he searched for the source of the coffee aroma. Computer monitors crashed to the ground, delicate instruments were crushed under his massive paws, and months of carefully collected research data were destroyed in minutes. "He's destroying the lab," Ingrid reported, monitoring the bear's progress through the facility's internal camera system. "The damage is extensive." For the scientists on the team, watching their life's work being destroyed was almost as traumatic as the physical threat they faced. Dr. Chen felt tears of frustration and loss as she listened to the sounds of her research being obliterated by forces beyond her control. The ice core samples that represented weeks of careful extraction and analysis were undoubtedly being contaminated or destroyed, along with the sophisticated equipment needed to process them. Equipment can be replaced, Bear reminded the group firmly. "Our priority has to be keeping everyone safe until help arrives." The bear's search of the laboratory yielded nothing of interest to him, and he soon moved on to investigate other areas of the building. His path was bringing him steadily closer to the communications center where the team had taken refuge, and it was becoming clear that their current hiding place would not remain secure for much longer. "We need to consider our options," Bear announced quietly to the group. "We can't stay here indefinitely, and he's going to find us eventually if he continues his current search pattern." The options were limited and unappealing. They could attempt to barricade themselves in one of the more secure rooms and hope the bear lost interest before finding them. They could try to drive him away, using the deterrent equipment they had distributed. Or they could attempt to evacuate through one of the other exits and seek shelter in the auxiliary building or the equipment storage facility. Each option carried significant risks. Barricading themselves offered temporary safety, but no long-term solution. Using deterrence might work, but could also provoke the bear into more aggressive behavior. Attempting to evacuate would require crossing areas where the bear might intercept them, and the other buildings offered less protection than their current location. "What about the emergency tunnel?" Dr. Tanaka suggested quietly. "The building plans show a maintenance tunnel that connects to the generator housing. If we could reach the tunnel, we might be able to get outside without encountering the bear." The emergency tunnel had been built as part of the station's original construction, designed to provide access to critical systems during extreme weather conditions. It was narrow and would require crawling, but it might offer a way to escape the building without alerting the bear to their movements. "The tunnel entrance is in the utility room, about 30 meters from our current position," Bear noted, consulting the building schematic on his tablet. "We'd have to cross 2 corridors that the bear might be using." "It's better than staying here and waiting for him to find us," Captain O'Brien pointed out. "At least in the tunnel, we'd have some control over our situation." The decision was made to attempt reaching the emergency tunnel, but it would require careful coordination and perfect timing. The bear's current position would need to be tracked precisely, and the team would have to move quickly and quietly to avoid detection. Yuki continued monitoring the bear's location through her acoustic equipment, while Ingrid used the camera system to provide visual confirmation when possible. The bear had moved on from the laboratory and was now investigating the station's main corridor, systematically checking each room and alcove. "He's in the meteorology station," Yuki reported. "That puts him approximately 50 meters from the utility room entrance. If we move now, we should be able to reach the tunnel before he finishes searching that area." The team began moving immediately, with Bear leading the way and Captain O'Brien bringing up the rear. They moved in single file, stepping carefully to minimize noise and stopping frequently to listen for sounds of the bear's movement. The 30-meter journey felt like 30 kilometers as they crept through corridors that suddenly seemed impossibly exposed and vulnerable. Dr. Chen found herself in the middle of the group, acutely aware of every sound. The soft whisper of their breathing, the barely perceptible squeak of their boots on the linoleum floor, and most terrifyingly, the distant sounds of the bear's continued exploration. Her scientific mind kept calculating distances and timing, trying to determine whether they would reach safety before their paths intersected with their massive pursuer. The utility room door was locked, but Bear had the master key for all station facilities. The lock mechanism seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence, though it actually produced only a soft click that was immediately masked by the sound of the bear investigating the meteorology equipment 20 rooms away. The emergency tunnel entrance was located behind a removable panel in the utility room floor. The panel had been designed for easy access during maintenance operations, but removing it quietly while 12 people crowded into the small room proved challenging. Every movement threatened to produce noise that might alert the bear to their location. "The tunnel is clear," Bear whispered after removing the access panel and shining a flashlight into the narrow passage below. "It's going to be tight, but everyone should be able to make it through." "Dr. Vasquez, you go first, followed by Thomas. I'll go last to make sure everyone gets through safely." The emergency tunnel was exactly as uncomfortable as anticipated. Designed primarily for equipment access rather than human passage, it was barely large enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement awkward and noisy, despite everyone's best efforts to remain silent. Dr. Vasquez led the way through the tunnel, followed by Thomas Kim, whose smaller stature made him better suited for the confined space. One by one, the team members disappeared into the narrow passage, with each person's progress marked by the soft scraping of clothing against the tunnel walls and the occasional muffled grunt of effort. Dr. Chen found herself in the middle of the procession, crawling through the claustrophobic darkness while trying not to think about what would happen if the bear discovered their escape route before everyone had made it through. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her, and the weight of the building above created a sense of being buried alive that was almost as frightening as the threat they were trying to escape. Behind her, she could hear the other team members making their way through the passage, their movements creating a subtle vibration that traveled through the tunnel walls. Ahead, the faint glow of Dr. Vasquez's flashlight provided the only illumination in the absolute darkness of the underground passage. The tunnel journey took nearly 20 minutes, though it felt much longer to everyone involved. The passage terminated in another utility room located in the generator housing, which was connected to the main building but could be sealed off independently. Once everyone had emerged from the tunnel, Bear sealed the access panel behind them and activated the emergency lockdown system that isolated the generator housing from the rest of the facility. "We're secure for now," he announced to the exhausted group. "This building has independent life support and communication systems. We can wait here until the storm passes and rescue arrives." Dicky, the generator housing was much smaller than the main building, but it was also more heavily reinforced due to the sensitive equipment it contained. The space included a small control room with emergency supplies and communication equipment, along with the massive generators that provided power to the entire research station. Captain O'Brien immediately began working to re-establish communication with Thule Air Base, using the generator housing's backup radio system. The equipment was older and less sophisticated than the main communication center, but it was functional and independent of the systems in the compromised main building. "This is Quanach Research Station Emergency Backup, requesting immediate assistance," he broadcast. "We have confirmed polar bear intrusion into main facility. All personnel evacuated to secure location. Require emergency extraction as soon as weather permits." The response came back almost immediately. "Quanach Station, this is Thule Air Base. We confirm your situation. Weather update indicates storm system is intensifying. Earliest possible extraction is now estimated at 36 to 48 hours. Maintain secure position and provide regular status updates." 48 hours suddenly seemed like an impossibly long time to wait in their cramped refuge. The generator housing had been designed to support emergency operations for extended periods, but accommodating 12 people for 2 days would strain its resources considerably. "We have adequate food and water for 48 hours, Bear announced after checking the emergency supply inventory. "The environmental systems can handle our numbers, but it's going to be crowded and uncomfortable." Crowded and uncomfortable proved to be significant understatements. The generator housing's control room was approximately 12 meters square, with most of that space occupied by equipment racks and control panels. The 12 team members found themselves pressed together in the small remaining area, with barely enough room for everyone to sit down simultaneously. Dr. Chen found herself wedged between Marcus Anderson and the main power control panel, trying to find a position that didn't interfere with critical equipment while providing some minimal comfort for what might be a very long wait. The constant hum of the generators, which had been barely noticeable in the main building, was overwhelming in the confined space of the control room. "At least we're safe," Thomas Kim observed, though his voice carried little conviction. The young graduate student had handled the crisis well so far, but the stress was beginning to show in his pale complexion and shaking hands. Elena Vasquez had positioned herself near Thomas, continuing to monitor his condition and provide emotional support. As the team's de facto medic, marine biology included extensive first aid training. She was concerned about the psychological impact of their situation on the younger team members. For the first few hours in the generator housing, the team's mood was relatively optimistic. They had successfully escaped the immediate danger, established communication with the outside world, and found secure shelter that could sustain them until rescue arrived. The fact that the polar bear was no longer an immediate threat allowed some of the accumulated tension to dissipate. However, as the hours passed and the reality of their situation settled in, the psychological strain began to manifest in new ways. The confined space, the constant noise of the generators, and the uncertainty about the bear's activities in the main building created a different kind of stress that was no less challenging than their earlier fear. Dr. Whitmore, who had been monitoring the weather situation through portable instruments, provided regular updates that were consistently discouraging. The storm system that had grounded rescue aircraft was proving to be larger and more intense than initial forecasts had predicted, with wind speeds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour and visibility near zero. "The storm has intensified to blizzard conditions," he reported at 8:30 a.m. after they had been in the generator housing for nearly 5 hours. "Current projections show it lasting at least through tomorrow evening, possibly longer." The news was a significant blow to morale. What had begun as an overnight emergency was evolving into a multi-day survival situation, with no guarantee that rescue would be possible even when the weather improved. Their food and water supplies, while adequate for 48 hours, would become critical if the delay extended beyond that time frame. Meanwhile, in the main building, the polar bear continued his exploration and territorial establishment. The team could occasionally hear sounds of his activities through the building structure, the crash of equipment being knocked over, the scrape of claws against walls, and the heavy footsteps of his movement through the corridors. "He's made himself at home," Ingrid observed grimly, monitoring the situation through the backup camera system. "He's spent most of the morning in the kitchen area, and he's found additional food supplies that we missed during our evacuation." The kitchen had indeed proven to be a treasure trove for the bear. In addition to the obvious food items in the refrigerator and pantry, he had discovered various containers of cooking oil, condiments, and preserved foods that provided a rich variety of flavors and nutrients. His success in finding these resources only reinforced his attachment to the location. More concerning was the bear's apparent comfort level within the building. Rather than showing signs of stress or confusion about being in an enclosed artificial environment, he seemed to have adapted quickly to the indoor conditions. His movements through the facility showed increasing confidence and familiarity, suggesting that he was beginning to view the research station as his permanent territory. "This is not typical polar bear behavior," Dr. Anderson observed, watching the monitor feeds of the bear's activities. "Normally, they avoid enclosed spaces and prefer to remain in open environments where they can escape if threatened. This individual is showing remarkable adaptability." The bear's adaptability was indeed remarkable, but it was also deeply troubling for the trapped research team. Every hour that passed strengthened the bear's territorial claim to the facility and reduced the likelihood that he would voluntarily leave when the weather improved. By noon on April 13th, nearly 12 hours after the bear had first breached the station's defenses, his behavioral patterns had stabilized into a routine that suggested long-term occupation. He had established sleeping areas in 2 different locations within the building, created food storage caches in several rooms, and marked his territory throughout the facility in ways that made it clear he considered the research station to be his home. "We need to start thinking about long-term solutions," Bear announced to the group during their midday meal of emergency rations. "Even when the weather clears and rescue becomes possible, we're going to have to deal with the fact that we have a 650-kilogram polar bear who thinks he owns our research station." The implications were sobering. Simply waiting for rescue would not solve their problem if the bear refused to leave when aircraft arrived. Tranquilizing a polar bear of that size would require specialized equipment and expertise that was not available at the research station. Attempting to drive him away by force would be extremely dangerous and potentially lethal for anyone involved. "What are the options for wildlife removal in this situation, Doctor?" Jen asked, though she suspected the answer would not be encouraging. "In normal circumstances, wildlife authorities would use a combination of deterrents and tranquilizers to relocate a problem bear," Bear replied. "But our circumstances are not normal. The nearest wildlife response team is at least 6 hours away by helicopter, assuming perfect weather conditions." Captain O'Brien looked up from the radio equipment where he had been maintaining regular communication with Thule Air Base. "I've been discussing the situation with the Rescue Coordination Center. They're consulting with polar bear specialists, but the preliminary assessment is that we're dealing with a very unusual situation. Bears don't normally establish territorial claims to human structures the way this one has." The unusual nature of their situation was becoming increasingly apparent. Polar bear encounters typically followed predictable patterns. The bears would investigate human settlements or facilities, sometimes cause damage while searching for food, and then move on to other hunting grounds. Establishing permanent residence in a human facility was virtually unprecedented in the literature on polar bear behavior. Could the changing sea ice conditions be affecting his behavior? Dr. Vasquez asked. If his normal hunting grounds have become inaccessible, he might be forced to adapt in ways that previous generations of bears never had to consider. It was a plausible theory that aligned with the growing body of research on climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife. As traditional hunting grounds became unreliable due to changing ice conditions, polar bears were being forced to develop new survival strategies that sometimes brought them into conflict with human activities. That would explain the territoriality, Dr. Anderson agreed. If he's learned that this location provides reliable access to food, he might be willing to defend it against any perceived threats, including human attempts to reclaim it. The psychological implications were disturbing. If the bear genuinely viewed the research station as his territory, he would likely respond to any intrusion, including rescue attempts, with aggressive defensive behavior. The arrival of helicopters, additional personnel, or wildlife management equipment could trigger a violent response that would endanger everyone involved. As the afternoon wore on, the team's physical discomfort in the cramped generator housing was compounded by growing anxiety about their long-term situation. The constant noise of the generators made conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible. The limited space meant that privacy was non-existent, and personal hygiene was becoming a significant concern. Dr. Tanaka had positioned herself near the seismic monitoring equipment, continuing to track the bear's movements throughout the main building. Her reports provided a detailed picture of his activities that was both fascinating from a scientific perspective and terrifying from a personal safety standpoint. He's established what appears to be a primary den site in the main laboratory, she reported during the afternoon briefing. He spends most of his resting time there, which suggests he considers it the most secure and comfortable location in the building. He's also created secondary resting areas in the kitchen and the equipment storage room. The bear's choice of the laboratory as his primary den was particularly distressing to Dr. Chen, whose life's work was contained in that room. The sophisticated instruments and carefully collected samples that represented months of research were being used as bedding material by a polar bear, transforming years of scientific effort into a nest for one of the world's most formidable predators. He's also showing territorial marking behavior throughout the building, Yuki continued. Scent marking, claw marks on walls and doors, and what appears to be deliberate arrangement of objects to create barriers and boundaries. The territorial marking was perhaps the most concerning aspect of the bear's behavior. It indicated a level of commitment to the location that went far beyond simple opportunistic feeding. The bear was investing significant time and energy in establishing permanent claim to the research station, which suggested that removing him would require extraordinary measures. Evening brought new challenges as the team attempted to organize sleeping arrangements in the impossibly cramped control room. 12 adults in a space designed for 2 or 3 created a logistical nightmare that tested everyone's patience and tolerance for close quarters. Dr. Chen found herself trying to sleep while pressed against the vibrating wall that housed the main generator, with Marcus Anderson on one side and a rack of electrical equipment on the other. The constant hum and vibration made rest nearly impossible, and the anxiety about their situation created a level of alertness that resisted even exhaustion. "This is going to be a very long night," Elena Vasquez observed quietly, her voice barely audible above the generator noise. The night indeed proved to be extremely difficult. The combination of physical discomfort, psychological stress, and the constant reminder of their predicament made rest elusive for everyone. Those who managed to doze fitfully were frequently awakened by the sounds of the bear's activities in the main building or by the need to adjust positions in the cramped space. Thomas Kim, already stressed by the overall situation, began showing signs of claustrophobia as the night progressed. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and he developed a persistent tremor that Elena recognized as a potential precursor to panic attacks. "I need to get out of here," he whispered urgently during the darkest hours of the night. "I can't breathe in this space. We need to do something." Elena worked to calm him using breathing exercises and reassurance, but it was clear that the psychological pressure was approaching dangerous levels for several team members. The combination of fear, confinement, and uncertainty was creating a level of stress that their training had not fully prepared them to handle. Bear Kozlowski, despite his military background and emergency response experience, was also feeling the strain of command responsibility in impossible circumstances. Every decision he made carried potentially lethal consequences for 12 people, and the available options were all variations of dangerous gambles with unknown outcomes. "We need to consider our alternatives," he announced quietly during the night, speaking just loudly enough to be heard by the team members who were still awake. "Staying here indefinitely is not sustainable, and rescue operations may not be possible as long as the bear considers the main building to be his territory." The alternatives were limited and unpalatable. They could attempt to drive the bear away, using the deterrent equipment they had brought with them, but that would require leaving their secure refuge and confronting a 650-kilogram predator in his chosen territory. They could try to wait out the bear, hoping that he would eventually lose interest and move on, but his territorial behavior suggested that was unlikely to happen quickly. "What about creating a distraction?" Dr. Whitmore suggested. "If we could draw him away from the main building, we might be able to re-establish control of the facility." It was a plausible strategy, but implementing it would require someone to venture outside the generator housing and risk direct confrontation with the bear. The volunteer for such a mission would be placing themselves in extreme danger with no guarantee of success. "I'll do it," Captain O'Brien volunteered immediately. "I have the most experience with dangerous situations, and my pilot training includes survival techniques that might be useful." Bear shook his head firmly. "No one goes outside alone, and no one goes outside until we have a detailed plan with multiple backup options. We're not going to risk anyone's life on a desperate gamble." The discussion continued through the night, with various team members contributing ideas and analyzing the potential risks and benefits of different approaches. The scientific training that had brought them to the Arctic proved valuable in developing systematic approaches to their survival problem, even though none of their expertise directly addressed polar bear conflict resolution. Dawn on April 14th brought no improvement in their situation. The storm continued to rage outside, grounding any possibility of rescue operations. Inside the main building, the polar bear continued his territorial occupation, showing no signs of losing interest in his newly claimed domain. Captain O'Brien's morning communication with Thule Air Base confirmed what everyone already suspected. Weather conditions remained prohibitive for aircraft operations, and the earliest possible rescue was still at least 24 hours away, possibly longer. The Rescue Coordination Center has been consulting with polar bear specialists from across North America, he reported to the group. "The consensus is that we're dealing with a very unusual situation that doesn't fit standard response protocols." The lack of established protocols for their situation was both troubling and oddly liberating. Without standard procedures to follow, they were free to develop creative solutions, but they were also entirely responsible for the consequences of their decisions. Dr. Anderson, who had spent the night reviewing everything he knew about polar bear behavior, presented his analysis during the morning briefing. "Based on the bear's territorial marking and den establishment, I believe we're dealing with an individual who has made a fundamental behavioral adaptation to environmental pressures. He's essentially become a house bear, a polar bear who has learned to live in human structures." The concept of a house bear was both fascinating and terrifying. If Anderson's analysis was correct, they were witnessing an evolutionary adaptation in real time, as environmental pressures forced polar bears to develop new survival strategies that included occupation of human facilities. The implications go far beyond our immediate situation, Dr. Chen observed. If polar bears are adapting to live in human structures, it suggests that traditional wildlife management approaches may be inadequate for future encounters. From a scientific perspective, their situation was extraordinarily significant. They were witnessing behavior that had never been documented in polar bear research, and their survival might depend on understanding and predicting patterns that had no precedent in the literature. However, the immediate priorities remained centered on survival rather than scientific observation. The team's food and water supplies were holding up well, but the psychological stress of confinement was becoming increasingly problematic. Several team members were showing signs of depression and anxiety that threatened to impact their ability to think clearly and make good decisions. "We need to do something to improve morale and mental health," Elena Vasquez announced during the midday meal. "The psychological pressure is becoming as dangerous as the physical threat." She was right. Dr. Tanaka had become increasingly withdrawn, spending most of her time monitoring the bear's movements and speaking only when asked direct questions. Thomas Kim's claustrophobia was becoming more severe, and he had developed a persistent cough that might have been psychological in origin. Even the more experienced team members were showing signs of strain that could lead to poor judgment and dangerous decisions. Bear Kozlowski decided to implement a structured activity schedule that would give everyone specific tasks and responsibilities while they waited for rescue. The schedule included regular equipment maintenance, detailed documentation of their experience, and rotating assignments for communication duties and environmental monitoring. "Everyone needs to stay busy and feel useful," he explained to the group. "Idle time in this situation is dangerous because it allows fear and anxiety to build up." The activity schedule proved helpful in managing immediate psychological stress, but it could not address the fundamental problem of their situation. The polar bear remained in possession of their facility. Rescue operations remained impossible due to weather conditions, and their supplies would not last indefinitely if the crisis extended beyond the current projections. By afternoon on April 14th, 36 hours after the bear had first breached their defenses, the team was forced to confront the possibility that their situation might extend well beyond the initially projected time frame. Weather updates continued to be discouraging, and the bear's behavior suggested that he had no intention of voluntarily abandoning his newly claimed territory. "We need to start planning for a week-long siege," Bear announced grimly. "Our food supplies will last that long if we're careful with rationing, but water might become a limiting factor." The water situation was indeed concerning. The generator housing's emergency supplies included enough drinking water for 48 hours at normal consumption rates, but 12 people confined in a stressful situation were consuming water at higher than normal rates. If their confinement extended beyond 4 days, dehydration would become a serious health threat. "There's emergency water production equipment in the main building," Dr. Whitmore noted. "But obviously that's not accessible as long as our friend is in residence." The reference to the bear as "our friend" had become a common way for the team to discuss their situation without constantly emphasizing the danger they faced. It was a small psychological defense mechanism that helped maintain morale while acknowledging the reality of their predicament. Captain O'Brien had been working throughout the day to establish contact with polar bear specialists who might be able to provide advice about their situation. Late in the afternoon, he succeeded in connecting with Dr. Margaret Thompson, a wildlife biologist from the Canadian Wildlife Service who specialized in problem bear management. Dr. Thompson has dealt with over 200 polar bear conflicts, he reported to the group. She's never encountered a situation exactly like ours, but she has some suggestions for strategies that might be effective. Dr. Thompson's advice, transmitted through the radio link, was both encouraging and sobering. She confirmed that the bear's territorial behavior was highly unusual but not unprecedented. Climate change pressures were forcing polar bears to adapt in ways that brought them into increased conflict with human activities. The key is to understand that he now considers this facility to be his habitat, her message indicated. Any approach that treats him as a temporary intruder is likely to fail. You need strategies that acknowledge his territorial claim while finding ways to coexist or negotiate his departure. The concept of negotiating with a polar bear seemed absurd at first, but Dr. Thompson's subsequent messages outlined specific techniques that had proven effective in similar situations. The strategies involved a combination of environmental manipulation, behavioral conditioning, and careful timing that could potentially convince the bear to relocate voluntarily. She's recommending something called territorial displacement, Captain O'Brien explained. The idea is to create conditions that make the facility less attractive to the bear while simultaneously providing alternative options that meet his needs. Territorial displacement would require creating artificial food sources outside the main building that would be more appealing than the resources he had already claimed. It would also involve making the interior of the building less comfortable through environmental modifications that would not endanger the human occupants. The strategy was complex and would require careful coordination, but it offered hope for a solution that did not involve direct confrontation with the bear. However, implementing the plan would require access to equipment and supplies that were currently inaccessible in the main building. We'd need to get into the equipment storage area to retrieve the materials for creating external food sources, Bear noted after reviewing Dr. Thompson's detailed recommendations. That means someone would have to enter the main building while the bear is active. The prospect of entering the bear's territory was terrifying, but it might be their only option for resolving the situation without waiting for external rescue that might be days or weeks away. The storm system continued to intensify, and weather projections now suggested that aircraft operations might not be possible for a week or more. Thomas Kim, despite his ongoing psychological struggles, volunteered for the dangerous mission to retrieve equipment from the main building. "I'm the smallest person here," he pointed out. "I might be able to move through the building without attracting the bear's attention." Elena Vasquez immediately objected to the plan. "Thomas is already under significant psychological stress. Asking him to confront the bear directly could trigger a complete breakdown that would endanger both him and anyone trying to help him." The debate over who should attempt the equipment retrieval mission continued through the evening, with various team members volunteering and others raising objections based on experience, physical capability, or psychological fitness. The decision was complicated by the fact that failure could result in death or serious injury, while success might provide the tools needed to resolve their crisis. As night fell on April 14th, the team faced their second night in the cramped generator housing with no clear resolution to their situation. The bear continued his occupation of the main building, showing increasing signs of territorial establishment that suggested he had no intention of leaving voluntarily. The psychological pressure continued to mount as team members struggled with the physical discomfort of their confinement and the emotional stress of their uncertain situation. Sleep remained elusive for most of the group, and the constant noise of the generators prevented the rest that might have helped them cope with their circumstances. Dr. Chen found herself lying awake during the dark hours, listening to the sounds of her colleagues' restless movement and the distant noises from the main building that indicated the bear's continued presence. Her scientific training kept analyzing the situation from multiple perspectives, searching for solutions that might have been overlooked in their desperate circumstances. The complexity of their situation was unprecedented in wildlife management literature. They were dealing not just with a polar bear encounter, but with a fundamental shift in polar bear behavior that represented an adaptation to environmental pressures created by climate change. Their survival might depend on understanding and predicting behaviors that had never been scientifically documented. As dawn approached on April 15th, marking 48 hours since the bear had first entered their facility, the team prepared to implement Dr. Thompson's territorial displacement strategy. The plan was dangerous and complex, but it represented their best hope for resolving the situation without waiting for external rescue that might be indefinitely delayed by weather conditions. The success or failure of their efforts would determine whether their ordeal ended in triumph or tragedy, and whether their experience would serve as a cautionary tale or a model for future encounters with polar bears adapting to a changing Arctic environment. In the cold mechanical hum of the generator housing, 12 humans prepared to negotiate with one of nature's most formidable predators for the right to reclaim their shelter in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The fate of the Karnak research station and everyone trapped within its walls hung in the balance as the Arctic storm continued to rage outside, and a 650-kilogram polar bear continued his territorial occupation of humanity's fragile foothold on the edge of the world. The next stories: The Last Trail, a Montana wilderness survival story. The morning mist hung low over Gallatin National Forest as 3 veteran educators prepared for what should have been a routine professional development retreat. Susan Parker, a 43-year-old environmental science teacher from Billings, adjusted her well-worn hiking boots one final time before shouldering her pack. Her weathered hands spoke of countless field expeditions with students over the past 20 years. Each scar and callus a testament to her dedication to outdoor education. Susan had grown up in rural Montana, daughter of a Forest Service ranger, and the wilderness was as familiar to her as her own classroom. James Holloway, 39, taught biology at Roosevelt High School in Great Falls. His tall, lean frame moved with the efficient grace of someone who spent every weekend on mountain trails. James had discovered his love for the outdoors later in life, after a career-changing divorce 5 years earlier had led him to seek solace in Montana's backcountry. What began as therapeutic hiking had evolved into a passion for wilderness education, and he now led the school district's outdoor programs. Linda Chen, 40 years old and a geography teacher from Missoula, completed their trio. Born in San Francisco to immigrant parents, Linda had fallen in love with Montana during graduate school at the University of Montana. Her initial culture shock at the vast open spaces had gradually transformed into deep appreciation and expertise. She specialized in using GPS technology and mapping in education, making her an invaluable asset on any backcountry expedition. The 3 had been selected by the Montana Education Association to participate in a week-long wilderness immersion program designed to help teachers integrate outdoor experiences into their curricula. The program, now in its 15th year, had an impeccable safety record. Participants would spend 5 days in a remote section of Gallatin National Forest, learning advanced wilderness skills, studying local ecology, and developing lesson plans that could bring the excitement of outdoor exploration into their classrooms. Dr. Robert Martinez, the program coordinator and a professor of outdoor education at Montana State University, had personally vetted each participant. The 48-year-old former park ranger brought 30 years of wilderness experience to the program. His assistant, Sarah Williams, 26, was working on her master's thesis in environmental education and served as the group's naturalist guide. Rounding out their official party was Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old wilderness first aid instructor and certified guide who would handle safety protocols and emergency procedures. The group had assembled at the Gallatin Gateway trailhead at dawn on April 18, 2024. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for their planned route through the Hyalite Creek drainage. Their destination was a remote camping area near Hyalite Lake, approximately 12 miles from the nearest road access. Susan examined their route on the topographic map spread across the hood of her truck. The trail would take them through diverse terrain, dense lodgepole pine forests, open meadows dotted with early wildflowers, steep granite slopes, and eventually to the pristine alpine lake that would serve as their base camp. The elevation gain was significant but manageable for their experienced group, rising from 5,200 feet at the trailhead to 7,800 feet at the lake. "Weather looks perfect for the next 4 days," James observed, checking his phone one final time before entering the area where cell service would become spotty at best. He had already sent a text to his ex-wife confirming he would be unreachable until Sunday, when they planned to hike out. His teenage daughter Emma was spending the week with her mother, and James felt a familiar pang of missing quality time with her. This retreat represented more than professional development for him. It was an opportunity to recharge and return home with new energy for his teaching and his relationship with Emma. Linda finished her equipment check with characteristic thoroughness. Her pack contained not only personal gear, but also the GPS units and mapping equipment she would use to demonstrate technology integration techniques to her colleagues. As the group's designated navigator, she had spent hours studying the route and identifying key landmarks and potential hazard areas. Her meticulous preparation had become legendary among her colleagues, and she took pride in her reputation for never getting lost. Dr. Martinez gathered the group for a final safety briefing as the sun climbed higher over the mountains. "Remember, we're entering prime grizzly habitat," he emphasized, his weathered face serious. "These mountains are home to one of the healthiest bear populations in the lower 48. We'll be following strict food storage protocols, maintaining awareness of our surroundings, and sticking together as a group at all times." He gestured toward the bear-proof canisters that would store all their food and scented items. "No exceptions, no shortcuts. Complacency kills in bear country." Sarah Williams nodded agreement as she distributed detailed information packets about local wildlife. "We're particularly concerned about a large male grizzly that's been reported in the Hyalite Creek area over the past 2 weeks," she explained. "Forest Service has designated him Bear 401, and he's estimated to weigh around 600 pounds. He's shown no aggressive behavior toward humans, but he's been very bold in approaching campsites looking for food sources. That's exactly why our food storage and camp hygiene protocols are so critical." Marcus Thompson added practical details about their emergency procedures. "Cell coverage is non-existent past mile marker 4, but I'm carrying a satellite communicator with emergency beacon capability. We also have detailed emergency evacuation routes mapped for various scenarios." He patted the GPS unit clipped to his belt. "Our check-in schedule with the Forest Service has us reporting location every 12 hours via satellite message. If we miss 2 consecutive check-ins, search and rescue protocols automatically activate." The 6 educators and guides set off at 8:30 a.m., their boots crunching rhythmically on the packed dirt trail. The early morning air carried the scent of pine resin, and the faint sweetness of early wildflowers beginning to bloom in the warming spring weather. Susan led the group, her experienced eye reading the trail and surrounding terrain with practiced ease. James walked second, periodically stopping to photograph interesting flora and geological features for potential classroom use. Linda brought up the rear with Dr. Martinez, discussing the finer points of GPS navigation and wilderness route finding. The first day's hike covered 8 miles through gradually ascending terrain. They paused frequently for educational discussions, with each team member sharing expertise in their specialty areas. Susan pointed out signs of recent bear activity, claw marks on aspen trees, overturned logs where bears had searched for insects, and distinctive bear trails that paralleled their hiking route. "These paths have been used by bears for generations," she explained. "They're following the most efficient routes between food sources and water." James documented various plant species with his camera, building a visual library for future botany lessons. He was particularly excited about several rare wildflower species they encountered, including the mountain lady slipper orchid and alpine forget-me-nots. His enthusiasm was infectious, and even the more experienced outdoor educators found themselves seeing familiar plants through fresh eyes, as James explained their ecological relationships and adaptations to high-altitude environments. Linda used the hike as an opportunity to demonstrate various GPS and mapping techniques. She showed the group how to triangulate their position using visible landmarks, how to calculate distance and elevation using topographic features, and how to plan alternate routes in case of emergency. Her technical expertise complemented the others' biological and ecological knowledge, creating a comprehensive learning experience. Their first night's camp was established at a designated backcountry site beside Highlight Creek, 4 miles from the trailhead. The location offered running water, established tent sites with bear-safe food storage lockers, and stunning views of the surrounding peaks. As evening approached, they followed strict bear safety protocols. All food and scented items were secured in the bear lockers. Cooking and eating areas were maintained at least 100 yards from sleeping areas, and everyone changed into clean clothes after dinner to eliminate food odors. Dr. Martinez led a discussion around their campfire about integrating outdoor experiences into classroom learning. "The goal isn't to turn every teacher into a wilderness guide," he explained. "It's to help you capture the sense of wonder, discovery, and problem-solving that happens naturally in outdoor environments, and bring that energy into your regular classroom instruction." Sarah Williams shared her research on the psychological benefits of outdoor education. Students who participate in wilderness-based learning show improved confidence, better problem-solving skills, enhanced environmental awareness, and stronger collaborative abilities, she said. Even brief outdoor experiences can have lasting positive impacts on academic performance and personal development. The conversation continued well into the evening, with each participant sharing their hopes for implementing what they learned during the retreat. Susan talked about her plans to establish a school-based weather monitoring station that would connect students with real environmental science. James described his vision for creating outdoor laboratory experiences that would make abstract biological concepts tangible and exciting. Linda outlined her ideas for using GPS technology to teach mathematical concepts through real-world navigation challenges. Their second day dawned clear and cool, with spectacular alpine views emerging as the morning mist lifted from the valleys below. The group broke camp efficiently, their movements showing the easy coordination that develops among experienced outdoor educators. Today's route would take them through more challenging terrain as they climbed toward Highlight Lake, gaining nearly 1,500 feet of elevation over 6 miles. The trail wound through increasingly wild terrain as they left the creek bottom and began climbing toward the lake. Old-growth forest gave way to alpine meadows dotted with massive granite boulders. Marcus Thompson used the varied terrain to demonstrate different hiking techniques and safety considerations for each type of environment. He showed the group how to read weather patterns in the mountains, identify potential hazard areas like loose rock or unstable snow, and make real-time decisions about route modifications based on changing conditions. Susan found herself energized by the challenging terrain and the opportunity to share her knowledge with colleagues who truly appreciated the wilderness environment. She had spent her entire career trying to communicate her passion for outdoor education to administrators and parents who often viewed field trips as expensive distractions from real learning. Being surrounded by like-minded educators who understood the profound educational value of wilderness experiences felt like coming home. James documented their progress with both photographs and detailed notes, already envisioning how he would share this experience with his students. He planned to create a multimedia presentation that would take his biology classes on a virtual journey through the ecosystems they were now experiencing firsthand. The transition from montane forest to subalpine environments provided perfect examples of how elevation, climate and geography influence plant and animal communities. Linda's GPS showed their progress with satisfying precision as they climbed toward their destination. She used the opportunity to teach the group about topographic map reading, showing how the abstract symbols and contour lines on paper corresponded to the dramatic landscape around them. Her enthusiasm for the technical aspects of navigation was balanced by a genuine appreciation for the beauty and complexity of the mountain environment. By mid-afternoon, they reached Hyalite Lake, a pristine alpine jewel nestled in a cirque of granite peaks. The lake's crystal-clear water reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror, creating a scene of breathtaking beauty that left even the experienced educators momentarily speechless. Their campsite was located on a small rise overlooking the lake, providing stunning views while maintaining appropriate distance from the water's edge. Setting up camp at this elevation required additional considerations for weather protection and food security. The established camping area included a bear-proof food storage system consisting of cables strung between trees at appropriate heights. All group members participated in properly securing their food and scented items, with Marcus providing detailed instruction on techniques and safety protocols. As evening approached, the group gathered for dinner preparation and their daily educational programming. Tonight's focus was on high-altitude ecology and the specialized adaptations required for life in alpine environments. Sarah Williams led a discussion about the unique challenges facing plants and animals at this elevation. Intense UV radiation, extreme temperature fluctuations, short growing seasons, and limited oxygen availability. The conversation was interrupted by their first direct wildlife encounter of the trip. A family of mountain goats appeared on the rocky slopes above their camp, moving with characteristic grace across seemingly impossible terrain. The group watched in fascinated silence as the goats demonstrated the specialized adaptations that allowed them to thrive in this harsh environment. Their broad, flexible hooves for gripping rocky surfaces, their dense fur for insulation against cold and wind, and their efficient cardiovascular systems for functioning in thin air. Dr. Martinez used the goat sighting as a teaching moment about wildlife behavior and human responsibility in wild spaces. Notice how they're maintaining distance from our camp while still accessing their traditional routes, he observed. That's the kind of respectful coexistence we need to model for our students. We're visitors in their home, and our behavior should reflect that understanding. The third day brought a significant change in weather patterns, with clouds building over the peaks during the early morning hours. The group's planned activities included day hikes to explore different ecological zones around the lake, with each participant leading a mini-lesson in their area of expertise. However, the developing weather situation required careful monitoring and possible plan modifications. Susan led the first expedition, a geological exploration of the granite formations that dominated the landscape around the lake. Her background growing up in mining country had given her solid understanding of rock formation processes, and she explained how the massive granite intrusions they were examining had formed deep underground millions of years ago before being exposed by erosion and glacial activity. James followed with a botanical survey of the alpine plant communities surrounding the lake. The harsh, growing conditions at this elevation had produced some of the most specialized and resilient plant species in North America. He showed the group examples of cushion plants that grew in tight, compact formations to conserve heat and moisture, and explained how many alpine species required multiple years to produce their spectacular but brief summer blooms. Linda's contribution was a practical navigation exercise that took the group to various points around the lake while teaching advanced compass and GPS techniques. She demonstrated how to take accurate bearings in challenging terrain, how to account for magnetic declination in navigation calculations, and how to use natural features as backup navigation aids when technology failed. The weather continued to deteriorate throughout the morning, with clouds thickening and occasional light snow flurries adding urgency to their activities. Marcus Thompson monitored conditions carefully, checking weather updates via satellite communicator and discussing potential plan modifications with Dr. Martinez. Mountain weather could change rapidly, and their safety protocols required conservative decision-making when conditions became questionable. By early afternoon, the decision was made to modify their planned evening activities and prepare for potential weather-related challenges. The group worked together to secure their camp against possible wind and precipitation, using techniques Marcus demonstrated for reinforcing tent guy lines, creating windbreaks, and protecting cooking areas from moisture. Sarah Williams used the weather delay as an opportunity to discuss climate adaptation strategies employed by alpine wildlife. Animals at this elevation have to be prepared for sudden weather changes, she explained. They have behavioral and physiological adaptations that allow them to survive temperature swings of 40 degrees or more in a single day. As if summoned by her words, their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a large, dark shape moving through the forest below their camp. Through binoculars, the group identified a massive grizzly bear, likely the same individual that Forest Service personnel had designated as Bear 401. The bear was approximately 300 yards from their camp, moving slowly along the shoreline of the lake as it searched for food sources. Dr. Martinez immediately gathered the group for an emergency wildlife protocol briefing. Everyone needs to remain calm and follow established procedures, he said quietly but firmly. Bears are naturally curious, and this individual has shown bold behavior around human camps. We need to ensure our camp is completely secure and be prepared to implement deterrent measures if necessary. The bear's behavior suggested it was familiar with human presence, but not necessarily afraid of it. This combination could be particularly dangerous, as bears that lose their natural wariness of humans often become more aggressive in pursuing food sources. The group watched as the bear methodically investigated various areas around the lake, its massive head swinging back and forth as it tested scents carried on the wind. Marcus Thompson activated the group's satellite communicator to send a priority message to Forest Service dispatch, reporting the bear's location and behavior. The response came back within minutes. Bear 401 had been reported by 2 other backcountry groups in the past week, and his behavior was becoming increasingly concerning to wildlife management personnel. The bear's presence dramatically altered the group's evening routine. All cooking activities were moved to a location downwind from the bear's apparent travel route, and everyone participated in creating a completely scent-free sleeping area. Personal hygiene items, sunscreen, insect repellent, and even toothpaste were secured with the food supplies in the bear-proof storage system. Linda monitored the bear's location using binoculars and her GPS unit, plotting its movements on her topographic map to identify patterns in its behavior. The bear appeared to be following a regular circuit around the lake, investigating specific locations where previous campers might have left food scraps or other attractants. Its methodical approach suggested learned behavior rather than random foraging. As darkness approached, the bear moved closer to their camping area, though it maintained a distance of approximately 150 yards. The group implemented their emergency wildlife response protocol. Bear spray was distributed to each team member. Noise-making devices were prepared for use if deterrent action became necessary, and everyone reviewed procedures for responding to different types of bear encounters. Dr. Martinez established a watch schedule to monitor the bear's activities throughout the night. Sleep is important, but safety is paramount, he reminded the group. We'll maintain continuous observation and be ready to respond appropriately to any changes in the bear's behavior. The night passed tensely, but without direct incident. The bear remained in the area, occasionally visible in moonlight as it continued its methodical search pattern around the lake. The watch rotation allowed most group members to get some rest, while ensuring continuous monitoring of the potentially dangerous situation. Sarah Williams had drawn the pre-dawn watch shift and was the first to notice the significant change in the bear's behavior. Instead of the slow, methodical foraging pattern it had maintained through the night, Bear 401 was now moving with obvious purpose directly toward their campsite. She immediately alerted Dr. Martinez and Marcus Thompson, who quickly assessed the situation and decided to wake the entire group. "Everyone up, quietly and calmly," Marcus whispered as he moved from tent to tent. "The bear is approaching camp, and we need to implement active deterrent measures." The group emerged from their tents to find the massive grizzly approximately 75 yards away and closing the distance at a steady walk. Its body language showed confidence rather than aggression, but the bear's size and determination created an extremely dangerous situation. James felt his heart rate accelerate as he got his first clear look at Bear 401 in the growing dawn light. The animal was even larger than he had imagined, with massive shoulders and a distinctive silver-tipped coat that marked it as a mature male grizzly. Its calm, purposeful approach was somehow more terrifying than obvious aggression would have been, suggesting a bear that had lost its natural fear of humans. Susan drew on her childhood experience growing up in bear country as she helped coordinate the group's response. "Stay together, make ourselves look large, and be ready with the bear spray," she advised quietly. "No sudden movements, no running. But we need to show this bear that we're not easy targets." Linda clutched her GPS unit reflexively, as if the familiar technology could somehow provide protection against 600 pounds of approaching predator. Her scientific mind continued functioning even in the face of immediate danger, noting the bear's gait, its body position, and the environmental factors that might influence its behavior. The bear paused at approximately 50 yards from their camp, standing on its hind legs to get a better view of the humans clustered near their tents. In this position, its massive size became even more apparent, with its head easily reaching 8 feet above the ground. The bear tested the air with its sensitive nose, gathering information about these potential competitors for food resources. Marcus Thompson made the decision to begin active deterrent measures. "On my count, we're going to make noise and try to convince this bear to leave the area," he announced quietly. "Yell, clap, bang pots together, but maintain group cohesion, and be ready to deploy bear spray if it continues approaching." The coordinated noise-making effort began with pots clanging, voices shouting, and hands clapping in a cacophony designed to convince the bear that humans were dangerous and not worth approaching. For several tense seconds, the strategy appeared to be working as the bear dropped to all fours and seemed to hesitate in its approach. However, Bear 401's reaction was not the retreat they had hoped for. Instead of backing away from the noise, the bear appeared to become more interested in the humans, taking several steps closer while maintaining its confident body language. This response indicated a bear that had likely been conditioned by previous encounters with humans, possibly including food rewards that had taught it to associate people with easy meals. Dr. Martinez recognized the dangerous escalation in the situation and activated the satellite communicator's emergency beacon, sending an automated distress signal that would alert search and rescue personnel to their location and situation. However, help was hours away at best, and they needed to resolve the immediate threat using their own resources and training. The bear continued its approach, now within 30 yards of the group. At this distance, individual faces became clearly visible, and the intelligent eyes studying them showed none of the wariness that characterized truly wild bears. Marcus Thompson prepared his bear spray, a powerful pepper-based deterrent that was effective at close range, but required precise timing and favorable wind conditions to deploy safely. Sarah Williams noticed that the bear's attention seemed particularly focused on their food storage area, where the bear-proof containers held all their supplies. "It's definitely looking for food," she whispered to the group. "Its behavior suggests it's had success raiding campsites before." Din! This observation explained the bear's bold approach and lack of fear, but it also provided hope that it might leave if convinced no food was available. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with the bear maintaining its position while apparently assessing the humans' threat level and the potential for accessing their food supplies. The group remained clustered together, bear spray ready, voices occasionally raised in attempts to discourage the bear's continued interest in their campsite. James found himself thinking about his daughter Emma and wondering if he would see her again. The reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. They were facing a large, confident predator in its own territory, miles from help, with limited defensive options. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the bear spray Marcus had given him, hoping he wouldn't need to use it, but preparing for that possibility. The critical moment came when the bear apparently decided the humans were not a significant threat and resumed its approach toward their camp. Marcus Thompson made the difficult decision to deploy bear spray when the animal reached the 20-yard threshold they had established as their final defensive line. The pressurized capsaicin spray created a visible cloud between the group and the approaching bear, carried by a slight breeze that fortunately blew away from the humans. Bear 401 encountered the irritating spray head-on, immediately shaking its massive head and retreating several steps as the chemical irritant affected its sensitive nose and eyes. For a moment, the deterrent appeared successful as the bear backed away from the camp area, shaking its head and pawing at its face in obvious discomfort. The group maintained their defensive formation while watching hopefully for signs that the bear would leave the area entirely and allow them to begin planning their evacuation from the lake. However, their relief was short-lived. After retreating approximately 50 yards and spending several minutes recovering from the effects of the bear spray, Bear 401 began circling their camp at a distance, apparently unwilling to give up on what it perceived as a potential food source. This behavior was extremely concerning, as it suggested a bear whose conditioning to associate humans with food was stronger than its natural avoidance instincts. Dr. Martinez consulted with Marcus Thompson about their limited options. Evacuation seemed like the most prudent choice, but breaking camp and beginning the long hike out while the bear remained in the area presented its own significant risks. Bears could easily outrun humans on any terrain, and a moving group might trigger pursuit behavior that could lead to an even more dangerous encounter. The satellite communicator provided their only connection to outside help, and Dr. Martinez sent detailed updates about their situation to Forest Service dispatch. The response confirmed that a helicopter evacuation was being organized, but weather conditions at their elevation made immediate extraction impossible. They would need to maintain their defensive position and continue deterrent efforts until conditions improved enough for aircraft operations. Linda used her GPS to identify potential evacuation routes that might allow them to reach lower elevations where helicopter rescue would be feasible. The topographic maps showed several possible paths, but all required crossing areas where the bear could easily intercept them. Her technical skills provided valuable information for planning their eventual escape, but the immediate tactical situation remained extremely challenging. Susan drew on her experience with predator behavior to analyze Bear 401's continuing presence around their camp. "He's treating this like a territorial dispute over resources," she observed. "Classic behavior for a dominant male who's learned that persistence pays off in confrontations with humans." This analysis suggested that simply waiting for the bear to lose interest was unlikely to be successful. The morning wore on, with the bear maintaining its patient vigil around their campsite, occasionally approaching closer before being deterred by noise and the threat of additional bear spray deployment. The group's limited supply of deterrent spray was a growing concern, as each canister contained only enough active ingredient for 6 to 8 seconds of discharge time. James documented their situation with photographs and detailed notes, partly from his natural inclination to record educational experiences, but also because he realized they might be creating a valuable record for other outdoor educators and wildlife management personnel. His scientific training helped him maintain analytical thinking, even in the face of immediate personal danger. The weather situation added another layer of complexity to their predicament. Clouds continued building around the peaks, and occasional snow flurries reminded them that mountain conditions could deteriorate rapidly. Being caught in the open during a weather emergency, while also dealing with an aggressive bear, would create an almost impossible survival scenario. Sarah Williams monitored their emergency communications while continuing to observe and document the bear's behavior patterns. Her research background proved valuable in recognizing subtle changes in Bear 401's body language and activity level that might predict its next actions. The bear's persistence was unusual even for a food-conditioned animal, suggesting other factors might be influencing its behavior. As the afternoon progressed, the group began experiencing the psychological strain of their prolonged emergency situation. Maintaining constant vigilance while preparing for possible attack required tremendous mental energy, and the stress was beginning to affect their decision-making capabilities. Dr. Martinez recognized these symptoms and worked to maintain group cohesion and morale. Marcus Thompson continued monitoring their tactical situation and updating their emergency response plans as conditions changed. The approaching weather front would force a decision about evacuation routes within the next few hours, regardless of the bear's continuing presence. Staying at their exposed campsite during a mountain storm was not viable, but moving through bear habitat during deteriorating visibility presented equally serious risks. The turning point came when Bear 401's behavior shifted from patient observation to active testing of their defensive perimeter. The bear began making short charges toward the group, stopping just outside effective bear spray range before retreating and circling for another approach. This escalation indicated that the bear was losing patience with the standoff and preparing for more aggressive action. Linda's GPS showed multiple potential escape routes, but all required crossing open terrain where they would be vulnerable to pursuit. Her analysis of elevation profiles and terrain features helped identify the path that offered the best combination of speed and defensive positions, but no route eliminated the significant risks they faced. The group made the difficult decision to begin a controlled evacuation toward lower elevations, where helicopter rescue would be feasible despite the deteriorating weather conditions. This plan required precise coordination and discipline, as any breakdown in group cohesion during movement could trigger a pursuit response. From Bear 401, Susan took point position during their evacuation, using her extensive trail experience to identify the safest route while maintaining awareness of the bear's location and behavior. Her childhood in bear country had taught her to read subtle environmental cues that might indicate predator presence, skills that were now literally vital to their survival. James carried the satellite communicator and maintained contact with rescue personnel, providing regular updates on their location and situation as they moved through the challenging terrain. His steady voice and clear communication helped coordinate the complex rescue operation that was developing around their emergency situation. The evacuation proceeded slowly and carefully, with the group maintaining defensive formation while covering the difficult terrain between their campsite and the nearest helicopter landing zone. Bear 401 followed at a distance, apparently unwilling to give up on these potential food sources despite their determined resistance to its presence. Dr. Martinez coordinated the group's movement while continuing to monitor weather conditions and communication with rescue personnel. His experience in emergency situations proved invaluable in maintaining group discipline and making tactical decisions under extreme pressure. The evacuation required constant balance between speed and safety, with any mistake potentially triggering a catastrophic encounter. Marcus Thompson served as rear guard during their movement, maintaining visual contact with Bear 401 while ensuring no group members fell behind or became separated from the main party. His wilderness first aid training and emergency response experience provided crucial expertise in managing their high-risk evacuation through bear habitat. The helicopter rescue team finally reached their location after a tense 4-hour evacuation through challenging mountain terrain. The professional rescue personnel were able to provide secure extraction from the bear encounter area, ending the immediate threat but beginning a lengthy process of incident investigation and policy review. All 6 expedition members were successfully evacuated without physical injury, though the psychological impact of their extended encounter with Bear 401 would require ongoing attention and support. The incident prompted significant changes in backcountry education protocols and bear management strategies throughout the Gallatin National Forest system. Bear 401 was subsequently tracked and relocated by wildlife management personnel, though its conditioned behavior toward humans continued to present ongoing challenges for Forest Service officials. The incident highlighted the complex relationships between human recreation activities and wildlife conservation in America's remaining wilderness areas. The 3 teachers returned to their respective schools with profound new perspectives on outdoor education and wilderness safety. Their experience became a powerful teaching tool for emphasizing the importance of respecting wildlife and understanding the serious responsibilities that come with ventures into wild places. Dr. Martinez used the incident to develop enhanced safety protocols for wilderness education programs throughout Montana. The experience reinforced the critical importance of emergency preparedness and the need for conservative decision-making when operating in areas with significant wildlife populations. Sarah Williams incorporated their encounter into her graduate research on human-wildlife interactions, contributing valuable data to ongoing efforts to understand and manage bear behavior in recreational areas. Her detailed observations during the incident provided insights that influenced wildlife management policies across the region. Marcus Thompson enhanced his wilderness safety instruction programs based on lessons learned during their Bear 401 encounter. His first-hand experience with extended bear deterrent operations became a valuable resource for training other outdoor professionals and emergency responders in similar situations. The incident report generated by their experience contributed to improved bear safety education for all backcountry users in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Their careful documentation and professional response to an extremely dangerous situation provided valuable case study material for wilderness safety programs throughout North America. Linda's GPS tracking data from their evacuation route became part of emergency response planning for the Hyalite Creek area, helping future rescue operations understand optimal evacuation strategies for bear encounters in that specific terrain. Her technical expertise and precise documentation proved invaluable for both immediate rescue coordination and long-term safety planning. The professional development retreat that began as a routine educational experience had transformed into a powerful reminder of the serious responsibilities and genuine risks involved in wilderness education. All participants carried lasting respect for the incredible predators that call Montana's mountains home, along with renewed commitment to sharing that respect with their students and colleagues.